said we were starting, so.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah.
Good morning. Hey, you know, there's a song that says, "This is the day the Lord has made." And I didn't know whether it would ever come. Didn't know, but welcome everyone. It is such a pleasure to see so many people here that are interested in Remi's legacy and are interested in carrying it further and forward. So I want to let you know right away that's your task, is to carry it forward. But I'm so, I know that we're going to have a wonderful, wonderful day. And many times at the beginning of the remarks, one has lots of thanks to give. And this is a day of gratitude. So I thank each and every one of you. I hope that by the end of the day I'll have been able to receive a hug and or give a hug to all of you. It feels like a community and a circle of friends. And how wonderful it is to have us sitting in circles where during the day we can share with one another freely and lovingly and with great wisdom. So thanks for being here. I also want to thank so many people, Rachel and Scott and Paul from the Center for Studies of Religion and Society. Some of you may know that Remi was the founding person with the vision for the center. And over the years, people have taken their turn to serve as the directors of the center. And we have here the first acting director. She was acting director. And Phyllis Denise is here. So Phyllis, I want to thank you for sowing the seed and beginning that blossoming, that blooming of this marvelous center. And Paul and your team, you know that you just bring so much energy and vision and joy to this center and possibilities. And I know that it was with a great deal of strong faith, but knowing that it would work, that he has kept the center in his heart as well as in his mind. So thank you ever so much for what you're doing. And yes, okay. And you will notice around and about you our two videographers, Ray Pench over here and Michael over there in the corner, who's doing all kinds of wonderful things. And Ray basically was the biographer, the videographer that Remi had for many, many years. So he has also put some DVDs out there, and you'll see the montage going whenever you wish. So thank you. I also want to thank, before they even come up here at any point, are the panel moderators, like Marie and Diane, and the panelists that have come from Ottawa, Toronto, Courtney, Victoria, Montreal. So thank you very much for being here. So today, as I said, I had actually likened this day to the reception that we never had after Remi's funeral because of COVID, where we remember who the deceased was, and we kind of also ponder and reflect upon what is it that I have learned from this person that I can keep moving forward with. So I noticed Gary Gary Gordon, the Bishop of Victoria, is also here. Gary, thank you very much for your presence among us and for So, without further ado, I want to thank the other part of the team, Doug Roche and Pat Jamieson, who are also here, to the great team that helped put all of this together. So thank you so much. So I would now like to present Dr. Paul Bramadat to you, the host of this symposium, for putting this all together. So Paul, welcome to your center. And thanks ever so much for the wisdom and the joy that you bring to the center. Paul.
So good to see so many people here today. When we initially started planning this, we actually thought we might get maybe 20 or 30 people. So we thought, well, there's like a little room over here we could book. And then it became pretty clear we were going to need to expand our imagination. So lovely to see you here. And thanks very much, Pearl, for those wonderful, warm opening comments. So I'm the director of the CSRS at UVic, and I'm delighted to be with you here to honor a man who has had such a major impact on all of our lives. I was quite blessed to have a very warm relationship with him for roughly the last decade of his life, and I think doubly blessed to run a research center which really owes its existence largely to the generosity of Remi and his friends. Meeting Remi brought me back to my early 20s when I decided to go into a field of religious studies because I was young, I was radical, and I was fascinated by liberation theology. I was fortunate during my MA work to have a chance to work with Gregory Baum, who was, as you know, a very dear friend of Remi at McGill University. So in some ways, Remi was part of my life even before I met him, and he continues to impact me and my life long after his passing. I am, in fact, reminded of Remi every morning as I walk past the St. John's Bible, a gift to the CSRS by Remi's friends. Many of you are donors to that project, so thank you very much. There are only 299 heritage copies of this masterwork in existence, and you can see 2 volumes of our copy at the back. They are guarded by one of our PhD students, so be careful as you approach it. Think pure thoughts, and make sure you don't have any food in or on or anywhere near your body when you walk up there, or else Jessica will see you to the door very quickly. But they're gorgeous documents, and please do enjoy them. That's what Remi wanted us to do with them when they got here. Like Remi and many of you, I remain curious about the ways religious and spiritual convictions and communities work to challenge and improve the status quo. And that makes this as good a time as any to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Now, as Pearl mentioned, in addition to serving as the overall host of today's event, I'm very pleased to, with those of you who have not been to UVic before or to the University Club, I'm so happy to have you all here. In addition to being the host of the event, I am also have the opportunity to welcome our keynote speaker for this morning, Dr. Michael Higgins. Michael was born in Toronto and spent his career teaching, writing, thinking, and learning about the intersections of faith, reason, and culture. Throughout his career, Higgins has held various academic positions, including as president or professor at institutions such as St. Jerome's University, St. Thomas University, and Sacred Heart University. He's also a senior fellow at Massey College and has been awarded 2 honorary doctorates. Higgins' prolific writing, which includes numerous books, I think about 30, articles and essays, including being a columnist for the Globe and Mail, reflects his desire to engage with the pressing questions of our time. His book, The Jesuit Disruptor, A Personal Portrait of Pope Francis, comes out with House of Anansi Press later this year. Just a quick word about format. Dr. Higgins will lecture for about 40 minutes, he's promised. Although those of you who know Michael and his speaking style will know that you should just get yourself really comfortable when he speaks. He and I share a common friend in David Seljak, and David required me to tease Michael this morning. Dr. Higgins will lecture for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 25 minutes or so for open conversation, which I will moderate. You'll see an order of service, so to speak, on your tables, and you'll notice in that there are plenty of opportunities throughout the day to meet with one another, to talk with Michael, and to renew friendships, and to celebrate the spirit of Remi De Roo. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Higgins.
Good morning, everyone. Last evening I discovered a couple of things I didn't know that threw me into a state of some dishevelment. One was the varied pronunciation of Remi's last name. I've been referring to him for years as De Roo, and then I discovered that he often referred to himself as De Roo. So, and there's some division of opinion as to which one is the more accurate. I think I'll stick with De Roo for the purposes of the text. Otherwise, I'll get confused and I'll be here longer than 40 minutes. I will be anyway, so brace yourself. So I'd like first of all to say Kitos to Paul. Kitos is Finnish for thank you. I discovered Paul is struggling to identify as inner Finlander, so I thought I would take the occasion to thank him in Finnish. Okay, enough madness. Now to the talk. Remi was not a renegade bishop. He was a radical pilgrim bishop. And what I want to do is provide a reflection today on the life and episcopal ministry of Remi De Roo. And I'm going to do this largely in the context of looking at him as a bishop. You have many speakers today are going to be talking about so many aspects of Remi's life. His social justice initiatives, his work with indigenous communities, his life as a priest. And that's all highly legitimate. And that fills out the portrait brilliantly by people who knew him, who were his intimates. I come at it from a slightly different perspective, and what I'm going to try to do is to situate him within the context of Canadian Catholic Church leadership over the last number of years, because he was, of course, also a bishop. Now, I was not one of Remi De Roo's intimates. I was not privy to his innermost thoughts, I was not a trusted confidant, and I was not a close work associate. But I was a friend. We knew each other, we collaborated on some things and shared a common ecclesiological vision, and we respected each other, which of course is the necessary foundation for any nurturing and creative undertaking. When St. Jerome's University founded Grail, an ecumenical journal, we asked De Roo to sit on the board, and he readily agreed. Douglas Ardletson and I did a biographical profile of him in our book, Portraits of Canadian Catholicism. He was an interviewee for my CBC series, Catholics, and on more than one occasion he spoke at the St. Jerome Centre for Catholic Experience at the University of Waterloo, the university's continuing and public education forum. But my very first encounter with him was as a high school student, poised to enter the seminary of the Scarborough Fathers in Toronto, when I read an article about him in the US Passionist Monthly called The Sign, and about his messy contretemps with a fiery nun and her menagerie that garnered global headlines, generated the annoyance of Rome, and proved to be none too good publicity for the recently installed Bishop of Victoria. More of that later. Remi was the Bishop of Victoria, British Columbia, who died at the age of 97, and was both the youngest bishop at the Second Vatican Council when it opened in 1962 with its first session, and the last remaining council father when he died in 2022. He was a controversy hound at the very beginning of his ministry, although in his memoir, Chronicles of a Vatican II Bishop, published a decade before his death, he writes that, and I quote, "I am inclined to shun controversy. I try to avoid confronting people." End of quote. Now, in all my oral and written contacts with De Roo, as well as poring over his various writings, have I ever discovered a taste for irony. So I can only assume that his disavowal of controversy as something he seeks or relishes must be taken as an honest statement of fact. But it runs counter to the perception most people have of him. Encased in controversy, at odds with factions and forces he sees as contra the gospel, whether in secular or ecclesiastical governance. Now, it may well be that in his long ministry as a bishop, De Roo shunned controversy, but controversy never shunned him. It was both his shadow and his platform. Perhaps the best known Canadian bishop in U.S. Catholic progressive circles, his American analogues being Archbishop Raymond Hunthausen of Seattle, Bishop Kenneth Antoner of Saginaw, and Auxiliary Bishop Thomas Gumbleton of Detroit, De Roo was a favorite of liberal Catholic publications and organizations, including Call to Action and the National Center for the Laity. But the biggest waves of controversy were generated in his own country, as his name became identified both in Ottawa and in Rome with causes and positions that were contentious, divisive, and insufficiently deferential to established authority. Now, like it or not, and I suspect he actually liked it, Remi became the media golden boy of Catholic leadership. He was the one who did not shy away from the press, the one, in fact, who actually courted a media audience, the one who dared to think aloud in public. He became Canada's celebrity bishop, the go-to hierarch who seemed beyond intimidation or even prudential discretion. But it wasn't always thus. He wasn't born to church notoriety. Quite the contrary. His roots were humble, rural Manitoba, a first-generation Canadian whose primary languages were Flemish and French. And as was not uncommon at the time with large Catholic devout families, some of the children became either religious or clerics. One of Remi's brothers became a priest and one of his sisters an Ursuline, but only one would become a bishop. Following on the advice of his parish priest, De Roo took his cours classique at the Collège de Saint-Boniface, one of the founding colleges of the Provincial University of Manitoba, followed by his major seminary studies and ordination in 1950. Almost immediately after he was sent for graduate studies in theology to the Dominican St. Thomas Aquinas University, more commonly called the Angelicum. It's part of the Roman Confederation of Pontifical Universities. His dissertation was on the relationship that exists between the queenship of the Blessed Virgin Mary and her assumption into heaven. Now, this is quite arcane Mariology, but especially apposite, however, given that the Assumption was formally proclaimed by Pope Pius XII in 1950. Now, Remi had been an ecclesiastical careerist, and Rome had a mighty legion of them then, as well as now, as illustrated by Pope Francis's repeated broadsides against careerism. One could conclude that the decision to write on Mary during a papacy with a particular Marian bent was an astute move with an eye to promotion. But that was not Remi. In 1962, he was appointed the ordinary of the Diocese of Victoria, and even before his episcopal ordination, he was off to attend the momentous Second Vatican Council's first session in 1962. As he observed in an interview, and I quote, "I was pitched into the very heart, if you will, of that dynamic inner circle that was promoting some of the newer ideas, plus the fact that as the junior bishop from Canada, I was given the secretarial responsibility of arranging for those guest speakers, what we called the pariki, who gave lectures to the Canadian bishops every Sunday. So I was in touch with the Congars and the Skillibexes and all the theological experts who were delighted themselves to have an audience of eager bishops to address. These sessions exposed me to the ferment of new ideas, and because I was bilingual, I had direct contact with a number of these key thinkers. I guess it is partly because of this experience that I spoke 4 times at the council. That and the ready flexibility of my fellow Canadian bishops." End of quote. From the council, Remi learned of the challenges facing a church called to engage rather than repudiate the cultures in which it is embedded. He was instructed in the conciliar values of raccourciment and aggiornamento. He encountered the creative and generative thinkers who shaped the church's self-understanding, and very importantly for this most pastoral bishop, beginning his ministry of leadership, he discovered that his church is a community of faith on a collective journey. Here's what he says. "One of the greatest insights of the council was the recognition of the church not as a fortress on a hill, but as a pilgrim people in the valley, walking in the dust, blood, and tears of a harsh history, allowing the very stuff of history with all its diversities to fashion us a people among whom God became incarnate." End of quote. Now, from the council, Remi incorporated into his ecclesiological vision the central doctrine of the Incarnation as his guiding principle of action, which is the radical insertion of God into the muck and mire, viscera, blood, and sinew of creation. The Incarnation is a messy business and not a mushy reality. It summons all Christians to an unnerving response to the realities of life on the ground, not a soft invitation to safe engagement. He wrote, "As a bishop, when I speak to the many issues foremost in the minds of my people today, my perspective is basically that of one who believes in the ongoing incarnation. I believe that the power of the redemption reaches into every sphere of human experience, the social, the cultural, the economic, the political, and the religious. It is my mission as a bishop to be concerned about all of these areas from a gospel perspective." End of quote. But such a ministry of oversight is never easy, as De Roo discovered when he found himself at loggerheads with a stubborn, savvy nun of resolute purpose and unimpressed by Roman threats. Mother Cecilia Mary Dodd had a formidable pedigree. The great-great-niece of Florence Nightingale was an Anglican nun working with children and the poor in Birmingham in England, until a concatenation of circumstances, familial, economic, and ecclesiastical, resulted in her moving to Canada, charged with the task of establishing a new Benedictine-inspired religious order, which she did in 1922 with the Society of the Love of Jesus. By 1937, however, she and most of her Anglican nuns, so these are Anglican Benedictine nuns, she converted to Roman Catholicism. What ensued were a series of astute land purchases, shifting vocational priorities, and some leadership changes, all resulting in the end with Mother Cecilia Mary electing the care of abandoned and neglected animals as her preferred ministry. Rome thought otherwise. She was told to give up her Good Shepherd shelter for animals and to return to her earlier foundation of St. Mary's Priory, which had evolved into a rest home and hospital for the elderly. She would do no such thing. De Roo was caught in the middle, and the international media attention pitting the benign, animal-loving real estate nun against the phalanx of church powers, Roman and local, proved a major test for the new Bishop of Victoria. In the Manichaean world of media casting, he represented the villain fighting the heroine. She was unbending. The shelter received numerous donations. She survived the kerfuffle, operating up to her death in 1989 at the age of 99, and she ultimately returned to her Anglican faith. De Roo, however, weathered the media storm as best he could. He was still essentially a novice bishop at the time, with only 2 years into his episcopal ministry, but he learned a few lessons about media practice that would serve him well in the years to come. He also learned something about litigation. Mother Cecilia initiated a court case against him, alleging that he was defrauding her community of assets worth more than $1.5 million. Although the court dismissed the case and entrusted De Roo with the assets, and although he would carefully establish a fund that would exist separate from other diocesan funds to ensure that there would be no accusations of personal profit and that the nuns would be taken care of for the rest of their lives, the future of this priory trust fund would be at the heart of subsequent travails down the line. Not for the nuns, as De Roo was true to his word, but for De Roo personally. It would be the darkest time of his priestly life. The investment scandals that surfaced following his resignation as bishop in 1999. But before that took central stage, De Roo would have several decades of prophetic, innovative, and bold leadership that would endear him to the Catholic community of Vancouver Island, embroil him in contentious encounters with many of his fellow bishops, assure him a spot in the media whirligig that ensued following his insertion into the public sphere, and create an episcopal persona that would carry him from pulpit to podium, aligning him permanently with the Catholic social justice movement and securing a firm place near the top of the magisterium's worry catalogue. As co-chair of the Theological Commission of the Canadian Catholic Conference, the forerunner of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops in 1968, De Roo was on the hot seat following the release of Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae, affirming the Church's traditional opposition to all modes of artificial birth regulation. Now, many in the Catholic world had been led to believe, following the unofficial release of the final report of the Pontifical Commission on Population, Family and Birth, that had been charged with the responsibility of making a recommendation to the Pontiff concerning current teaching, banning all means of artificial birth contraception, that change, real change, was on the horizon. Cardinals, bishops, metropolitans, heads of dicasteries, everybody believed, not everyone, but great numbers believed change was imminent. That wasn't going to happen. Paul VI had concluded that changing the teaching would undermine the moral authority of the Church and the papacy. As one missionary and noted demographer noted, however, and I quote, Arthur McCormick, who was a Mill Hill father and professor from England, "Nothing has done more harm than Humanae Vitae to that very authority, which reached its lowest ebb as the protests mounted and the motivation for the encyclical became clear. Few documents in the course of the long and turbulent history of the Catholic Church have caused such widespread and immediate consternation and opposition." End of quote. The Canadian bishops sought to directly confront the high level of anxiety and confusion among Catholic laity and parish priests, both by issuing a statement that would address the growing unease over practice and doctrine, conscience and official teaching. Although De Roo identifies himself providing central leadership in the drafting of the bishop's pastoral position, what would become known as the Winnipeg Statement, and not unreasonably given that he was co-chair of the Theological Commission of the CCC, his name doesn't actually surface in the narrative of the one who is tagged as the primary author of the statement, Gerald Emmett Carter. In Carter's recollection, De Roo barely merits a mention. Carter, at the time, was Bishop of London and a decade later Archbishop of Toronto, followed by creation as a cardinal shortly after, remained De Roo's bête noire throughout their respective episcopacies, although they did have an abiding trust and respect for each other. Carter's involvement was historical. He had been approached in 1964 by the then Archbishop of Winnipeg, the very scholarly and loved Basilian George Flaff, to prepare a response to a questionnaire issued by the Holy See, which had been designed to test the waters regarding contemporary attitudes and expectations around the potential change to birth regulation in the Catholic world. Carter's report did not make light of the contemporary unhappiness over the Church's position and the concomitant turmoil generated by Rome's perceived indecision. The report was forthright, it was sympathetic, but it was also comprehensible. That was 1964. In 1968, any confusion around Rome's official position was now off the table. But unhappiness and turmoil and panic were hardly abated. They were compounded. And so Flaff's successor, Philip Pocock, turned to Carter and asked him to help the Theological Commission, of which Remi was co-chair, to craft its statement. At first he demurred, but then he accepted. He went to the room in which the bishops were closeted and where he found Bishop Emmett Doyle of Nelson, BC, banging away on a typewriter, surrounded by members of the Theological Commission, most prominent of whom was Remi. They were panicky as it was now late on Wednesday evening and their deadline was noon on Friday. They were at a total loss, and they hadn't even proceeded beyond the first paragraph. Pocock told Carter that they thought, "You could help us put this thing together," and so he did. The Winnipeg Statement, in Carter's own words, was a consequence of his being both editor and amanuensis. He was, as he says, "My authorship was not of my substance, but of the bishop's." Whatever specific role De Roo played in the fine-tuning of the Winnipeg Statement, and there is little indication that his contributions were substantive and determinative, there can be no doubt of his central role in handling the media furor that followed the formal release of the statement at a press conference convened to launch the document itself. Along with Archbishop Maurice Baudot of St. Boniface and Bishop Alex Carter of Sault Ste. Marie, the president of the CCC and Emmett's brother, De Roo stick-handled the release with his emerging gift for balancing aplomb with transparency, loyalty with conscientious querying. Here's what he said. Each insisted that the bishops had not intended to make a doctrinal statement, but that they had attempted to help the people of God in Canada, to face the agonizing situation in which they found themselves after the encyclical. The bishops had rejected simplist attitudes, either ignoring the encyclical or regarding it as a legalistic document, and they had, above all, rejected the contraceptive attitude within marriage. Now there was predictably some resistance to the statement by a minority of bishops, Archbishop Joseph Wilhelm of Kingston, Bishop Joseph Ryan of Hamilton, and Archbishop James Carney of Vancouver. But the vast majority of the bishops were on side. Pope Paul VI acknowledged the quality of their work and the integrity of their position when he said, and I think this is very important to know, "L'acciamo con soddisfazione." We accept it with satisfaction. The Winnipeg Statement. Now this would not be, however, the last time that De Roo and Carney found themselves on a collision course. Temperamentally and theologically, the two West Coast prelates were stunning opposites, representing a contrast in ecclesiologies and church governance that was mirrored in the two Catholic publications covering their respective dioceses, Island Catholic News and BC Catholic. Now, whatever differences in style and pastoral position that obtained between the two BC bishops, open warfare was never an option. But things did change when Remi became the co-chair of the Social Affairs Commission of the now CCCB, and that body issued its New Year's Day 1983 declaration, Ethical Reflections on the Economic Crisis, a galvanizing call for social justice that created both national and international reverberations. If De Roo was, as he says he was, non-confrontational, he had a strange way of showing it. The gloves were off. He simply could not have been unaware that a document issuing from the CCCB touching on the distinctly political topic of economic inequity in the country would stir up a hornet's nest of commentary, a thunderingly expansive way of outraged reaction along with rich endorsements and accolades. And now, of course, New Year's Day is a traditionally soft media day, with producers eager to showcase anything capable of rousing the public spirit from its torpor. So the timing was perfect. The timing was also providential. Canada was reeling from many economic downturns. The Prime Minister of the moment, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, seemed powerless to reverse the inimical financial trends. Sounds relatively contemporary, it seems to me. Corporations and businesses were maximizing their profits at the same time as ordinary citizens were falling behind, and public unrest was growing. Some direction from the nation's bishops was imperative. The Social Affairs Committee had worked through several drafts and the bishops had their input. Efforts were made to expedite the process. The president of the CCCB at the time, Archbishop Henri Legaré of Gouard-McLennan, had declined to publish the document as an open letter to Trudeau, and he waffled on whether to bypass the administrative board of the CCCB and delete from the agenda of the plenary assembly of bishops because of the socially divisive nature of the document, and that prompted De Roo to directly confront Legaré. He wrote, "This document is important. It is very important, Archbishop, for the nation, and you have been sitting on it. What are you going to do?" Even then, he was reluctant, Archbishop Legaré, to bring our statement out. He was busy preparing his own Christmas message, and he had the option of electing to publish an economic statement being prepared by somebody at head office. I went after him. I told him that we have simply got to do something. We cannot remain silent. Eventually, he relented. I suspect he did. The appearance of Remi on the national airwaves, fronting the social justice message of the CCCB, starkly and with arresting clarity, woke up the country to a new phenomenon. Catholic bishops inserting themselves into the political arena on something other than gynecological issues. For De Roo and his commission members, the hard challenge facing the affluent Catholic in Canada is the recognition that a faith that does not influence every sphere of human and social activity is a sterile faith. The economic and political orders are not immune to the critical eye of the Gospels. We are the stewards and not the overlords of creation. We are summoned by our faith to serve the poor, not suppress them. Justice is inextricably linked to faith. It is not a separate political adjunct. De Roo would note, and I quote, "If we remain silent in the face of oppression, in the face of massive unemployment, in the face of what I identify as moral evils, and we do not invite Christians to bring into play the countervailing forces of good, our silence must be seen as a political statement. A church silent in the face of persecution is making a political statement. There is no neutrality in the face of persecution." End of quote. Now, using words like persecution and oppression is confrontational. Canadians may have had deep misgivings about government policy and management, but language that was redolent of Marxist discourse, social democratic critiques of the economic and political order, and revolutionary fervor are identifiable dimensions of the new Democratic Party. And although Ethical Reflections is no political manifesto, it is steeped in earlier CCCB social justice documents, and it was fluently grounded in papal social teaching, especially Pope John Paul II's 1981 Laborum Exercens on the priority of labor. The public perception in many corporate and ecclesiastical sectors that Ethical Reflections is simply church speak for socialism posed a serious obstacle to its wide acceptance. 2 years after the publication of Ethical Reflections, the Social Affairs Commission issued Defending Workers' Rights, A New Frontier, and this provoked even greater resistance in the corridors of power, corporate and chancery. Leading the opposition was Cardinal Carter, adroitly deploying the articulate and aggressive skills of businessman, recent convert, and formidable polemicist Conrad Black. The tycoon and the historian castigated the bishops for what he saw as their hopeless naivete in relying on one specific ideological critique of the socio-economic order as if it were Holy Writ. He dismissed De Roo with his socialist cliches, as he dubbed them and what he saw as De Roo and his fellow travellers' contemptuous embrace of the secular at the expense of the transcendental. In his column for the Globe and Mail's report on Business Magazine on Holy Economics, Black musters his penchant for Baroque prose to a devastating personal end. I quote, "With passing years, the bishops have become more trendy, biased, misleading, and desperate for attention. Of course, the Church has the right and often the obligation to speak out on secular issues that have moral implications. I am not so convinced that the local successors of the apostles have an unarguable right to do violence to the credibility of their venerable institution by identifying it with sophomoric mishmash of false prophecies, factual errors, reflexive prejudices, and naive velleities. Their reckless guilt-mongering has given new meaning to Malcolm Muggeridge's description of the great liberal death wish. The sacking of the egregious Bishop De Roo from the chairmanship of the Social Action Commission in 1986 raises the hope that the episcopate has thought better of forsaking the ancient sources of sincere adherence while aligning the Canadian Catholic Church with the indifferent, the skeptical, and the contemptuous attitudes that many of their documents unwittingly incite." End of quote. Now, one's never in any doubt about Lord Black's position on anything, but if you were, the language makes it very clear he was ticked off. The contest between the two prelates was bitter. De Roo paid a heavy price, being excoriated by Black, being replaced as chair of the Social Affairs Commission, taking a drubbing by laissez-faire economists in public. But Carter, too, suffered a diminution of respect in many Catholic circles for his easy alliance with the political and economic potentates with whom he consorted, and for his willingness, indeed compulsiveness, in electing to side with his business friends over his episcopal peers. This was especially true when it came to defending the T. Eaton Company from what he considered an ignorant and calumnious misjudgment of monumental consequence. The CCCB document Defending Workers' Rights, A New Frontier, referred specifically to the iconic retail company during a time of strained labor relations. It became unofficially known as the Eaton's Statement. Carter wrote to De Roo. They had a private correspondence. As I said, they were often at the opposite end of the spectrum, but there was an abiding respect for each other as bishops. Carter wrote to De Roo privately about the position taken by the Social Affairs Commission, and he scolded him for his misplaced zeal and for not appreciating the simple truth that, and I quote the Cardinal, taking up a strong position almost certainly and inevitably involves exaggerations and the slanting of views. Certainly the truth seldom lies in the extremes in which it is presented. For instance, no one in his right mind would pretend that in the past few decades no single labour union has been guilty of excess. In the human condition, a totally unbiased neutrality is impossible. This is true. But when any group is either mandated or sets itself up as a judge, it must make every effort to be as neutral as possible. My statement was and is that the commission that you chaired made a judgment, found certain parties guilty, and yet never heard the defence. A single phone call to the proprietors of the T. Eaton Company would have brought you the information which would have anchored your statement. This omission remains to me incomprehensible. End of quote. De Roo, however, remained resolute. Polite, but resolute. The need for the Canadian bishops, he argued, to take a public role in the political and economic issues in the country that contributed in any way to rectifying inequities, to constructively inserting justice priorities into the marketplace, was a moral imperative that should not be compromised. Secure in his knowledge of papal social teaching and the long record of justice positions taken by the CCCB in the past, De Roo pushed ahead as best he could. His strategy of engagement with the political and economic powers appalled Carter and some other leading bishops at the same time as it mobilized other bishops to think more concretely about their episcopal obligations, and with the advantage of hindsight, we can see now that the Social Affairs Commission's exposure of the inefficacy and bogus nature of trickle-down economics has been confirmed again and again in subsequent decades by economists, analysts, and sociologists. In addition, De Roo's principal adversaries were humbled. The T. Eaton Company went into receivership, and Conrad Black went to jail. Before his statutory resignation as bishop, I'm just cutting some of the speak. I thought I had 60 minutes, and then I was reminded that I have 40, so it's slightly a little more truncated, but I'm going to put this on my blog if any of you want the complete text for free. Before his statutory resignation as bishop, De Roo had already drawn Rome's attention. He gave a key address at the Women in the Church Challenge for the Future 1986 conference in Washington, D.C. My wife and I, she's a liturgical musician and writer, were among the many hundreds of attendees who participated in the event. I was there primarily to interview the Benedictine sister Joan Chittister for my CBC Ideas series called Monasticism as Rebellion, and there was great intellectual energy and spiritual vitality throughout the entire convention halls of the Omni Hotel. People were there in the hundreds. De Roo's address was not incendiary. Far from being the most radical of speeches, it was, in its way, ironic, drawing on the various synodal interventions and CCCB documents concerning women, sacramental ministry, and the signs of the times. He was not saying anything that could not be found in the interventions of Cardinals Flach and Louis-Albert Vachon, the one-time primate of the Canadian Church. But the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, as it was then called, under the direction of its prefect, the formidable Joseph Ratzinger, and future Benedict XVI, were not placated by references to senior Canadian prelates of liberal sensibility, nor indeed by the list of bishops who were marshalled to support De Roo's fidelity to the Church. De Roo was summoned to meet with Ratzinger, where he was chastised and humiliated, treated in his own words as an errant schoolboy. And this is an interesting aside here. I interviewed Cardinal Ratzinger when I was writing the biography of Emmett Carter in the Holy Office in Rome. And I found him charming, comfortable in English, erudite, a kind of European cultured intellectual, really of the 19th century, not of the 20th century, but by no means in any way hostile. The experience of clerics and bishops with the cardinal prefect were rather different. Very often as lay people, we think that, if you find yourself in a situation like this, you're going to be chastised or summoned or berated. That's rarely the experience. But it is not, however, or wasn't at one time, the experience of many bishops, including Cardinal Carter. Rome's interest didn't wane after his resignation, De Roo's resignation either. He was instructed by the nunciature in Ottawa to decline the invitation to speak at an international federation of married Catholic priests on the grounds that his presence would be a source of scandal and confusion. He complied, though he was saddened that he was once again treated in a summary way and, as he says, silenced without discussion. Now, there is a sweet and sour irony in De Roo's tortured relationship with Roman authorities at the time. His sensitive attention to what was often dismissively referred to as the woman's issue also embroiled his old episcopal confrere Emeric Carter, so now they were ready for round two. Although De Roo was regularly cautioned on matters of women in the church, his brother Bishop Cardinal Carter found himself under the gun to make a statement reiterating the church's traditional teaching on the inadmissibility of women to presbyteral ministry. Unable to quash the discussion around women in the priesthood, and increasingly agitated, both John Paul II and his premier deputy in all matters of orthodoxy, Cardinal Ratzinger, prevailed on Carter to issue a formal document. Now, this is my speculation on the issue, drawn from the interview with Ratzinger in his office in Rome, at which time the prefect praised Carter's pastoral letter. Now, you contrast the warm welcome Carter received from the Curia with how De Roo was treated at an ad limina visit in Rome, when he respectfully but persistently inquired of Pope John Paul II, while the Pope and several Canadian bishops were at dinner, if it wasn't time to consider the ordination of mature married men, the viri probati, as so many Canadians were being deprived of the Eucharist. John Paul was at first very hesitant to engage, and ignored the request, but as De Roo returned again and again to that matter, the Pope slammed his fist on the table and proclaimed, Deus providebit, God will provide. Roma locuta est, Roma venita est. Rome is spoken, the matter is over. For Carter, although he would have found the blunt pontifical closure of discussion chastening and infuriating, he was not shy about taking on an issue, especially when such an issue consisted of the backyard stirrings of discussion and discontent among graduate students of theology at St. Michael's College, University of Toronto, for which he functioned de jure as Chancellor, as well as rumblings in the press and among women priest advocates. Carter felt compelled to take a public stand, in spite of knowing that the Furies would descend upon him. And so Carter's Do This in Memory of Me was released on December the 8th, 1983, designed to be a statement on priesthood and not on the ordination of women, although clearly the thrust of the document, the origin of the document, and the reception of the document suggest otherwise. Its argumentation, when not tortuous in its philosophical expression, constrained in its conviction, and dependent on a dated anthropology, remained rooted in the tradition. Still, in spite of insisting that the question of the ordination of women has been settled by the magisterium, Carter had written to the Catholic Women's League and said, and I quote, formal and normative, and we are required as Catholics to respect and obey it. Carter's attitude toward the ordination of women to the ministerial priesthood was actually firm and clear enough in some respects, but he remained characteristically flexible behind the scenes. In a private correspondence he wrote, and I quote, as far as anyone's opinion goes about the ordination of women, it disturbs me not at all. I am not sure that the last word has been said on the subject, and a counterposition to what the Church has taught so far is not, in my view, heretical, at least not yet. Because my position is, I think, a little more advanced than the Pope's, and therefore I should not parade it in public. We can see why he didn't want this letter circulating. So what was Carter's position? The one you can find in his CWL address, or the one communicated in a private correspondence to his biographers? It was in fact both. The result of Carter's determination to be Rome's man in Canada, although not deferentially or cynically, so anyone who knows him knows he was very much his own person, resulted in having to negotiate a public relations strategy that had him situated as both an enlightened and liberal Canadian cleric at the same time as a traditional servant of Peter. De Roo, by contrast, was far less the diplomat. He was more transparent and consistent in his views, but no less controversial when addressing the neuralgic issues confronting the Church in the post-conciliar era. Although Carter was his ecclesiastical contrary, and although they clashed, and as we have seen sometimes very publicly, together they demonstrated that Catholic concerns are fundamentally human concerns, that media contestation is not a bad thing, and that leadership demands a platform and a hearing. Now to sum up. As his friend and longtime collaborator Patrick Jamieson has observed, and I quote, De Roo modelled a new way of being a bishop for Canada and in his own way the Church Universal. He lived out the new paradigm introduced by the Council and in his own right was a force to be reckoned with due to his sharp focus and in-depth aptitude within the church hierarchy. As a farmer's son, his was a concrete theology. End of quote. And indeed, folks, it was concrete. It was practical, it was post-conciliar. It's a fine example of what academicians call contextual theology. But his leadership, inclined to the oracular sometimes, but person-focused, was not sometimes without its failures of omission. The clerical sex abuse crisis, a crisis Massimo Fagioli, the prolific and respected church historian, names as the greatest moral crisis to afflict the Catholic Church since the Reformation, did not spare the Diocese of Victoria. But I know of no diocese in the country that remains largely untouched by the contagion of abuse. As the late spiritual writer, priest and popular retreat giver Daniel O'Leary opined, and I quote, "The clerical model of the church authority has drifted too far from the vision of the carpenter's son." Commentators refer to the idolatrous pull of power, privilege, and possessions that subtly infect even the most religious organization when an isolating clericalism replaces a living servanthood. Beyond the scandals, a radical reform of the whole church is essential, its purpose and vision urgently needed. And this reformed church will have much to say to the world, but first it must befriend it. The secular postmodern world is God's body too. End of quote. De Roo understood in his bones what O'Leary meant and attempted, often heroically, to embody a Reformation consciousness in his mind and ministry. But on the issue of clerical sex abuse, his record is not unblemished. For sure, like the rest of the universal hierarchy, he was caught unaware of the breadth and systemic nature of the abuse, prioritized the church's reputation over the victims, privileged the counsel of psychiatrists, lawyers, and accountants over their pastoral consciences, and struggled to make sense of a pervasive problem few fully comprehended. In 2010, the lawyer and broadcaster, my colleague and co-author Peter Kavanagh, published a book called Do This in Memory of Me, a critical inquiry into the clerical abuse crisis. It's been used in various ethics courses and by seminary rectors and others since. Once you begin doing the study, you realize how multi-variegated and complex it is. And so an easy identification of villain is never particularly helpful. But what is important to recognize is that bad decisions were made and bad counsel was given. We know much better now. De Roo's handling of the cases that fell under his oversight, Bill Jacobs, Gerhard Hartmann, and to a lesser degree Harold McEntee, was inadequate. It was dismissive and it was defensive. And although it tarnishes his reputation as a social justice bishop, it does not compromise it, nor does it diminish its wide efficacy. Now, this is not in any way to make light of the suffering of the victims. Their pain is real. Their cause for recognition, repair, and reparation morally legitimate. It is a matter of moral urgency. But De Roo, in the end, is in many ways a Francis or Bergoglio bishop. The current papacy is his kind of papacy. Theologian Susan Wood, drawing on German Cardinal Walter Kasper's Pope Francis's Revolution of Tenderness and Love, notes the following, and then I actually do end. A pastoral magisterium and the pastorality of doctrine have as their starting point concrete experiences rather than abstract doctrine, which distinguishes Pope Francis from his predecessor Pope Benedict XVI. The idea is that where Pope Benedict begins with the faith of the Church, seeking to make it understandable both intellectually and spiritually to implement doctrine and practice, Pope Francis begins with the concrete situation. attempting to evaluate circumstances according to the rule for discernment of spirits and to arrive at concrete practical solutions." End of quote. De Roo's own pastorality, whether a methodology, a theological praxis, or an ecclesial modus operandi on the ground, defines his essential leadership. Like the current Bishop of Rome, who publicly declares his status as a sinner in need of mercy, De Roo fit the template of the wounded and imperfect but ideal Francis Bishop. Bishops Mark Seitz and Daniel Flores in the United States, Archbishop Don Bolin and Bishop Claude Hamelin of Canada are just some bishops who exercise in their own respective ministries qualities of the De Roo leadership. And that is a legacy of record. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. That was brilliant.
So good morning, everybody. I think that everybody knows me, but in case you don't, I'm Sister Marie Zarowny with Sisters of St. Anne. So I'm thrilled to be moderating this august panel today, and to be with all of you. Dr. Higgins mentioned Navalny, and it reminded me that I just wanted to recall for all of us that today's the second anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. And so we continue to hold the people of Ukraine and in our prayers and in our hearts and in our action in whatever way we can carry that forward. I'd like to just start with a comment that some of you have heard me say. A number of people have referred to Remi as having been ahead of his time. And I think it's often done in the context of, wouldn't it have been great if he had been bishop when Pope Francis were Pope? I'd like to take a different perspective on it, and I'd like to suggest that, in fact, from my perspective, he wasn't ahead of his time. He was a man and a bishop of his time and for his time. And I think those of us who are here are testament to that. There was a readiness within us to respond, to hear, and to enter into a vision of church that he was coming to learn about himself and working and developing with all of us. And so I guess in terms of what happened after that, it's in a sense the backlash, which always happens. You know, I mean, the ebb and flow of history suggests that. You move forward, you move backwards, and go a little bit forward again, and move a little bit backwards. But I think that there was a lot that was going on in the world and in the church that prepared for the Second Vatican Council, and that prepared us for Bishop Remi. So from the perspective of the Sisters of St. Anne, I was in my early years of formation as a young adult and as a Sister of St. Anne. At the time of the council, we were prepared for it because our leaders in our community had been exposed, you might say, to the new theology that was being talked about at that time and being shared, focus on scripture, openness, much greater openness to the world. And so we were ready for the influence of Bishop De Roo. We were ready to be influenced by him. We were ready to collaborate with him and to work with him to promote the kind of church, the kind here on Vancouver Island that he was sharing with us as a result of the council and a result of his own past experience. He had been very involved in social action before he became a bishop. So it's, I guess I just wanted to bring that little bit of context into it. One additional thing I'm going to say about that is that as I reflected back to that time, one of the things that stays with me is how he brought the world to us, to the Church of Vancouver Island. He brought it to us as a community. Never again would we view local issues outside of a global context. Never again would we view church concerns only in a North American context, but rather looking at various issues from the perspective of the body of Christ, the people of God in other parts of the world. And that has continued to influence us, and I suspect it's continued to influence all of us here and many others that are not here. So with that, it's my joy to introduce our first panelist, Sue Rambow. Sue and her husband, Ralph, have lived in an intentional Christian community called Emmaus House for 39 years. They have 3 married daughters and 5 grandchildren. Sue has a Bachelor of Education and taught as an elementary school teacher. She later became the program coordinator for immigrant settlement in the Comox Valley. Sue will speak more of the Emmaus community, but I want to mention that in 2015, I think it was, she published a book, Welcoming Strangers, about their experience in living in this intentional community. And I know that she happens to have a number of copies with her, which she will be happy to pass on to you for a donation of your choice.
To Remi's fund.
To the Remi Fund. Is there a fund? Yeah, so Pearl knows something about it. Okay. Okay. So in 2000, the year of the volunteer, Sue received the, sorry, can't read my own writing here. The Governor General's Volunteer of the Year Award. She has also received the Citation for Citizenship Award from the town of Comox and the BC Government Certificate of Appreciation for Operation Parasol, the resettlement of 31 Kosovars in the Comox Valley. And Sue will speak of Bishop Remi's legacy as shepherd and root the wonderful things that we've heard this morning in the local experience. Please join me in welcoming Sue. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to speak of Remi. I keep saying Remi, Bishop Remi De Roo, as our shepherd. I wish you to experience with us how we experience Vatican II, shepherded to us by Remi. This evening, present with us are Andre and Mary Catherine. I'd like you to raise your hands, please. And they are our co-community members. We've lived together for 38 years in community with economic sharing, and we built a centre for outreach. It is called Emmaus. As we journey together, we share and we discover Christ in our midst, and we've journeyed with many people in this time. The early disciples, when they experienced the call of Jesus, they left their former ways to live a new life. This is the story of the various calls we have experienced as we became recipients of the call of Vatican II through Remi De Roo. His legacy to us has been the implementation of formation programs within the diocese that radically altered our understanding of church. Excuse me. Allergies, please. What it means to be authentically living out the gospel message, both personally and communally. We experienced a vibrant, exciting, inspiring new way of church, led and mentored by a courageous bishop who had a vision that included a preferential option for the poor, diversity, ecumenism, the value of community, need for intergenerational relationships, and who encouraged the role of women and taught us a new understanding of the gospel message. Call, spiritual search. After the cultural upheaval of the 60s and early 70s, and personally riding on the back of 10 months of extensive international travel, including a bus trip from London to Kathmandu, my husband and I settled down to raise a family in the Comox Valley. Thus began our quest, searching for meaningful ways to integrate our faith in the inequalities and injustice we had encountered firsthand in our travels. Remi, fresh from the vision of Vatican II, was bishop of our diocese. It was during the council that the Church of the North encountered the bishops from the Church of the South. They shared the struggles of their people, and liberation theology was the need at that time. In response, the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops established the Canadian Catholic Organisation for Development and Peace to address the international issues of injustice of our time. So we had a call to international solidarity. Development and peace, supported and encouraged by Bishop Remi, was a significant influence in our diocese. We became educated in social analysis, were involved in major fundraising campaigns annually, national political initiatives, all on behalf of global justice. They were all supported through fall action programs, Shareland annual programs. Global South presenters came and visited our parish and told us stories of their struggles for justice, and they stayed in our home. For 31 years we worked on these programs with people of God from different parishes, and it was a beautiful time of deep caring community, collaborative actions and solidarity. But these exposures changed us and called us to simplicity. So we experienced a call to economic sharing, and I do have to mention that it was with the Ignatian discernment process that we went through this. We experienced that call to embrace the gospel where actions on behalf of justice become integral to our living out our faith. How to do this in a first world context. As families with young children, we still needed to raise and educate them with opportunities for their future. Our final decision was influenced by the bishop's radical document called From Words to Action. We decided to live an alternative model of community, particularly with commitment to regularly shared prayer. We set up a legal commitment whereby we co-owned half of each other's properties next door to each other. And we shared gardens in the workshop, and we built the extra suite. So we had a suite upstairs, my mum lived in a suite downstairs, and we had an extra suite for service. Our families, we all had lots of kids. There were 12 in the original commitment, and there's 4 of us now continuing with the economic commitment. Our families, they experienced living in solidarity with people with disabilities, numerous refugee families, the elderly, and an array of people and organisations who use the community area. We were family-oriented and intergenerational in our activities. Our gifts of leadership were shared within the church locally, diocesanally, and nationally. Participation in our local church was all-inclusive, and in a maize community, the main leadership was with women because the men were still very career-oriented at that time. Another call. the call to establish Large Comox Valley. One member of our community, Loch Mawini, supported by his wife Joanne and Andre Mary Catherine, envisioned a different call to establish Large Comox Valley. Approved by the bishop and greatly supported by our local church, it took from 1983 to 2000 to open the first home, Jubilee House. Now there is the I Belong Centre with 6 living suites, and work is well underway to build a cluster housing for 14 people with disabilities. A call to retreat work. Many retreats were hosted over the years. We used to put on nights at the Sisters' Cottage, the Sisters of St. Anne, who helped us all the way. In particular, Remi was committed to attending the annual Faith and Sharing retreats at Bethlehem Centre. As the kids danced and we did gospel skits and played through creative liturgies and laughed and cried and shared meals, Remi would sit there and he was apt to say, "This is church." The Christian Life Community was another call. Remi discerned the need for his people to be nourished and sustained in their faith journey as they worked in often contentious areas of social justice. Hence, the Prayer Companion program was initiated with training workshops held at Queenscourt House, presented by Jesuit mentors. Remi personally invited 7 members of our community to complete the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius in everyday life. It was a 1-year retreat with spiritual direction, a transformative experience. Through the Prayer Companion training, we met Father John English, S.J., who later invited our Emmaus group to become part of an international movement of Ignatian-based Christian life communities. And we still participate in that movement, presently hosting 2 new Christian life communities, all of whom have completed spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius as well. Then there was a call to justice action within Canada. We've done lots of work internationally. Within Canada and locally, many complex issues were demanding attention. To help educate these people and to help us understand how to act and advocate on an immense number of issues, Bishop Remi invited Sister Marie Zarowny, Sister of St. Anne, to set up the Office of Social Justice in the diocese. Dave's over there too. Dave Szolossy. We tackled diverse issues that are all the same: world hunger, immigration, native land claims, unemployment, global debt, refugees, corporate responsibility and trade issues. Still working on it. There was another call, ecumenism. It was an exhilarating time. Our experience of being Christians involved working with many diverse groups. As we collectively address human rights abuses in South Africa, Latin America and Eastern Europe, we had collaborative relationships with 10 Days for World Development, the Interchurch Community for Human Rights in Latin America, Kairos, and locally with the Film Festival Society and Fair Trade Group. And we had visitors from many different countries come, and one family came and they were a singing group and they travelled around and we raised funds, sent clothing home with them. They went back and the father was shot in the back. He died. He was a great advocate. So, we had saints come and live with us. There was a call to refugee sponsorship. Remi established the master agreement process for sponsoring refugees within the diocese. And this way, we found a very tangible way to respond to global suffering. Emmaus Community, first using the diocesan master agreement, then later using groups of 5 sponsorship, have sponsored and lived with 2 families from Vietnam, Bosnia and Herzegovina, a family of 12 from Central America. From Kosovo, we had the resettlement of 31 people from Kosovo. I coordinated that. And 2 families from Syria through to the family of Ukraine that we lived with last year. Now, just a final anecdote. Pearl asked if I would share one anecdote about Bishop Remi. Every year, the Faith and Sharing Retreat hosted a week-long family retreat at Bethlehem Centre. One time when we were all gathered in the chapel, I had occasion to return to the residences. And this impression stays with me forever. In the washroom block nearby, I saw our bishop on his hands and knees scrubbing the floor of the washroom block. Our humble shepherd who gave us the legacy of Vatican II. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. As Dr. Higgins said earlier, Bishop De Roo was able to concretize the pastoral approach of the Second Vatican Council, and I think what Sue has shared with us is exactly that, the concretization of what he did with their community and throughout the diocese. So thank you so much. I'd like to share a little bit about Michael McBane. Mike McBane worked with Bishop Remi De Roo from 1982 to 1990 in the Social Affairs Office of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, and has spent his career working in social justice coalitions. Since his retirement in 2014, he has become a student of Irish history and folklore in the Ottawa Valley, and is the author of Bytown, 1847, Elizabeth Brewer and the Irish Famine Refugees. He and his wife Joanne are the proud grandparents of Kara and Gavin, and parents of Jacob, Mark, and Thomas. I'm always interested that grandparents name their grandchildren first. Mike will share his experience of working with Remi on social justice issues as social affairs in Ottawa in the early 80s, and especially the work that they did on the ethical reflections on the economic crisis. Please join me in welcoming Mike McBane.
Thank you, Maureen. It's great to see you again after close to 40 years. I want to thank Pearl and Doug and Pat Jamieson for organizing this event, and of course the folks at the Center for the Studies of Religion and Society, Rachel, Scott, and Paul. What an extraordinary gathering of people. What a testament to friendship. Speaks volumes, especially Pearl and Doug. Remi is here because we're all here. And to jump to the end, I wanted to end with a quote from Michael Cherney. It continues to speak to us. That's why we're here. I was young. This was my first job when hired by the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops to work in the Social Affairs Office. Fresh out of university, this was my dream job, to be a researcher in social justice. Can you imagine being a paid agitator? So when I started in 1982, it was fairly quiet. I was being initiated, being given little research jobs. And then Ethical Reflections document came out, and all hell broke loose. What an initiation. I must say, though, that as you get a sense from Dr. Higgins' description of what happened, Remi never caved in. He never walked away from the pressure. And believe me, there was a lot of pressure. But at the same time, an amazing amount of doors are opening up to the work of social justice as a result of that statement. Just a lot of things came together. I remember being told at the time there were senior cabinet people in the Trudeau government that were really worried about this New Year's Eve statement because it touched on ethics. And they weren't sure whether the Catholics of Canada, which happened to be a lot of people, were going to be influenced by this. So they felt very threatened because they didn't know the extent of the scope of what impact this would have if people actually took ethics into account when it comes to economics. So the potential threat to the economic system was large. Now, I suppose in hindsight, you could say that they needn't have worried that Catholic capitalists were going to take this to heart. But nonetheless, there was a lot of worry out there. I remember in the midst of all this pressure, Remi saying, where you stand determines what you see. And that, of course, is a window to his methodology, which goes back to Catholic Action, See, Judge, Act. And I mean, the other point I want to make before time is up, I need to watch, is I work with Remi in a team concept. Remi was part of communities of resistance. He was not a lone figure. So as a bishop of the diocese, you tend to be seen in isolation as a leader. But when Remi was working with the Social Affairs Commission and office, he was in a team working with other organizations in coalitions, interchurch coalitions with labor, working with academics. So it was a very different context to see him in a team, and it was in that context that he was co-chair, as Dr. Higgins mentioned, with Bishop Adolphe Proulx. So working with both, they were both more powerful and able to resist some of the pressure from Cardinal Carter and others. I remember Bishop Proulx saying, similar to what Remi said, was referring to the Liborum Exercens, the priority of labor over capital. And Bishop Proulx would say, on y croit ou on y croit pas. You either believe it or you don't. But it's life-changing if you believe it. And of course you could say that about the gospel, you say that about a lot of things. Once you understand something, whether it's consciousness raising, whatever, you can never not understand again. So it changes you. And it changes who you work with. It changes your whole life. So I was really, really fortunate to have been mentored by at that time, by these people, who, of course, as you know, were plugged in internationally and intersected with great drama with what was going on especially in Latin America. And so those are the kinds of things I wanted to mention briefly. I guess just to end with the observation that the opposition that was received, and Dr. Higgins referred to Cardinal Carter and his sidekick, Conrad Black, the opposition hasn't gone away. There's some great articles about a lot of the opposition to Francis is rooted in what's called the prosperity gospel. Can you imagine calling something the prosperity? It's kind of the mirror opposite of the preferential option for the poor. It's a preferential option for the rich. And that's what we're facing today. So the work needs to continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, for bringing us that perspective from the Social Affairs Office, and the reminder that when Remi was there, he was working as part of a community of people and not standing alone, and that's very key, as you mentioned. So I'm going to move now to Christine. And Christine earned a PhD in Christian ethics from St. Paul University in Ottawa. In 1998, she was hired in the Department of Theological Studies, Concordia University in Montreal, where Christine continues to teach courses in ethics, bioethics, Indigenous spirituality, and Lonergan studies. She is a member of the Boothroyd Band in British Columbia, in the Fraser Valley, which is part of the Iglakatma, sorry, I thought I had this right, Iglakatma First Nation. And her paternal grandfather was a respected elder among his people. So Christine will speak about social justice from an Indigenous perspective and say a few words about Remi's work on behalf of Indigenous people in the Victoria Diocese and beyond. Please welcome Christine Jamieson.
much, Marie, and thank you, Pearl and Doug and Pat and Paul for inviting me to be here. It's really an honor. I want to begin by quoting an indigenous Mexican who is a nomadic storyteller. His name is Gustavo Esteva, and here are his words. What we need today is not more critiques of how the system does not work, for there are many excellent critiques. What people need, what ordinary men and women need, are examples of alternatives, examples of people who amidst all the chaos are incarnating alternatives, so that we can know that something makes sense and that if others can act on it, so can we. End of quote. I believe this is what Remi De Roo brought to his encounters with many people. But I wish to focus on his encounter with Indigenous men and women who he worked with and was an ally among. In his approach to social justice, he brought incarnated alternatives in his very person and in his positive approach to the world he was entering. He wanted to listen. He wanted the circle to be the model or the symbol that directed relationships rather than the hierarchy. This brings to my mind 2 points. First, Pope John XXIII's vision presented something distinctly different when he convened the Second Vatican Council. It was a vision stemming from a deep conviction that human beings are essentially good, and so the world is essentially good. Thus, the Pastoral Council was first of all an approach. Thus, the Pastoral Council was first of all to approach the world with open hearts rather than condemnation. Secondly, Remi De Roo recognized and was deeply moved by this vision. He moved forward in his life and vocation following this vision. It was a vision that shaped his sense of social justice. His personal motto, to build in love, is a concrete example of what would direct him throughout his entire vocation and indeed his entire life. He shared something of the sensibility of Indigenous peoples, and they recognized that. His encounter with Indigenous peoples on Vancouver Island solidified this social justice approach as he found welcoming, appreciative encounters. Encounter is a key word here. To truly encounter another is to listen to them and to see them in who they are. Remi De Roo did this. Indigenous peoples also listened to him and heard him. He became a trusted elder and a member of the First Nations communities on Vancouver Island. Bishop Remi was adopted by Indigenous peoples and given the name Great High Priest White Swan. Chiefs from many different Indigenous nations attended that ceremony, and Remi was welcomed as a member of their communities. I believe his willingness to truly encounter Indigenous peoples on Vancouver Island opened the hearts of the people. They knew he was honest, wise, humble, brave, truthful, respectful, and loving. He concretely acted from and embodied these sacred teachings that express the core of what many Indigenous peoples consider is needed to be a good and just person, to walk a good and just road. They recognized in Bishop Remi a good and just man. His social justice manifested in his concrete engagement as an ally of Indigenous peoples, not only on Vancouver Island, but throughout Canada and even beyond. It was witnessed when he presented at the Alaska Native Review Commission Roundtable on the place of Native peoples in the Western world. Here he was not afraid to name the evil of colonization and recall the horrors that so many Indigenous peoples have suffered not only at the hands of the government, but also at the hands of the Christian churches and their missionaries. The kind of physical and spiritual violence that was perpetrated on Indigenous peoples continues today among Christians. This was a constant source of sadness for Remi and an imperative to speak truth to power. Remi understood deeply that the churches and missionaries did not bring God to godless people, but that the Creator was encountered and lived in relationship to Indigenous peoples long before Christian missionaries arrived. Naming the evils was not the only component of his important message, though. The other was to recognize the richness of Indigenous cultures and all they have to teach the Western world. I suspect, as the son of a farmer, Remi came to value the land in a unique and unusual manner compared to most Western peoples. This land connection was hugely valuable in helping Remi to understand Indigenous people's relationship to the land and all that relationship entails. This is the other side of Remi's critiques. This is his alternative, a profound recognition of the richness and value that Indigenous peoples, a profound recognition of the richness and value that Indigenous peoples' ways of being and acting in the world represent, and how much we need to learn from them if we are to survive in this world. The alternative was Remi's concrete suggestions and the possibilities he raised of how Indigenous and non-Indigenous Christians and all peoples can walk together in a good way, in a way that will go far in addressing the many challenges we face today. In my view, this recognition was the undertow of Remi De Roo's social justice in his relationship with Indigenous peoples. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christine, and especially for bringing the perspective of the Indigenous people into our midst, and we deeply appreciate that. So, David Szolossy, down there at the end of the line, worked as the director of the Office of Social Justice for the Diocese of Victoria from 1984 to 1991. As my successor, I might add. I hadn't realized we both served 7 years in that role. On leaving Victoria, he went to Toronto to complete his MA in theology while serving as the CCCB representative on different ecumenical coalitions. Most of his career was spent as a high school teacher and chaplain, and then president of his union unit. At the same time, he served 3 terms as Ward 3 councillor in Georgina and continued his international solidarity work. David Szolossy.
And I just want to add my thanks to everyone involved in making today happen. And truly, since said a few times, Remi is indeed present. He is here with us. I want to start with one story that's just come into my mind listening to everyone else. It ties back to something Sue and Phil will recognize the story. In the early 80s, it was a very offensive campaign in the Archdiocese of Toronto to promote vocations to the priesthood. And there were billboards put up around the city of a very graphic, gory, crucified Christ hanging above the city skyline with the caption, "Dare to be a priest like me." Well, a few of us got involved in a little bit of guerrilla tactics in response to that, and we produced large posters of a foursome on a golf course, including Archbishop Carter, Conrad Black, Weston, and Eaton, together on the golf course with the caption, "Dare to be a priest like me." Remi was not that kind of priest. So when we're demonstrating Bishop Remi's focus that I'd like to speak about on the intersection of church and civil society and politics in the broad sense of that word, in pursuit of the common good. The first example I want to talk about is his assumption as the first chair of the BC Human Rights Commission and establishing that process in British Columbia. Remi served in the 1970s as the first chair, appointed by Premier Dave Barrett. The responsibility to promote human rights is not just something to be spoken about in Bishop Remi's perspective, but the vision of justice he taught includes living with the obligations of promoting human rights. We've talked a lot about ecumenism. Before we go that, we talked a lot about ecumenism so far today, and that was a very, very significant central portion of Remi's attention and an essential element in the pursuit of social justice, not in a hypothetical way, but in concrete practice. This was part of his core attentive listening, that it was vital, too, that the churches speak together in solidarity with the First Nations voices. Now, in order for that voice to be authentic, I remember on one occasion we gathered together with the Anglican bishop at the time, United Church moderator, Lutheran bishop, the clerk of the Society of Friends meeting, church members and First Nations members to prepare a joint statement in support of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. The process defined the product. It was the process that was so key to that. This particular project gave rise to ongoing meetings between the church leaders and the Premier. At the time I was involved, it was Van der Zan. Why does that get a laugh? Anyway, to discuss issues of social concern. One such meeting led to the immediate reversal of the government's plans to cut social assistance rates. And I'd really like to go into that because it's a great story, but another time. But the practice of meeting with the Premier began under the premiership of Dave Barrett, who once said, he never made a serious decision in government without consulting Remi. I want to indulge a little bit in speaking about how Remi and his vision and mission and obligation to pursue social justice impacted me and my understanding of the teaching of the church. Now, I followed his teaching and talks through the Social Affairs Commission long before I arrived in the diocese. But working with him influenced my life in many ways and made much of what he shared with me, the impact he made, it affected my later actions and engagement, my personal understanding and embrace of what it meant to have a justice spirituality. He was a teacher, more so than an activist, but it was his teachings that inspired people to take the social teaching of the church seriously. From his roots in the cooperative movement that has been addressed, he gave constant support for the labor movement as a vehicle for the realization of social justice. For example, in my first year in the diocese, when the famous Players Cinema workers were locked out during contract negotiations, the Social Justice Commission of Victoria issued a statement in support of the workers and joined their picket line. Bishop Remi was not directly involved, but we operated with the confidence that the actions taken were totally consistent with the teachings he provided us with. It was also clear when a number of church employees around the diocese sought to address certain grievances. We had met together several times, leading to meeting with the John Shields, at the time president of the BC and Government Employees Union, about the feasibility of organizing church workers. I spoke with Bishop Remi about what we were doing. There was no secret, so nothing clandestine. And he said to me that I would be doing him a big favor if I pursued this. Unfortunately, other members of the diocesan structure were not so supportive. That's, again, another story. Now, I know I'm not speaking for myself only when I say that how much Remi influenced me, but all of us here would probably make that same claim. At the same time, though, we influenced him in his striving for articulating what social justice meant. He breathed the reality of everyone he met, and informed him in refining the theological and biblical basis into a lived praxis. The social justice vision of Bishop Remi was a constituent part of how he saw the new structure of the church we've addressed. He led the 10-year synodal process in the diocese, anticipating the current Pope's calling of a similar global consultation with the laity. In this way, he was particularly visionary and presaged Pope Francis's call for a global synod. And our decisions, our Vancouver Island Synod, especially the sessions on marginalized Catholics, certainly reflect the dialogue in the global church today, and reflected particularly in the declaration Fiducia Supplicans.
Well, you covered a lot. So thank you, David, for once again rooting us in what the realities were that were being dealt with in the diocese at that time, and how Remi engaged in them, influenced them, and was influenced, as you so ably brought out. Thank you. So, as we bring this session to a close, as you can experience, is what you've heard is barely a taste of the richness of what could be said about Bishop Remi and social justice. And I'm sure each one of you were thinking of how you would amplify what each of these speakers said. And I'm hoping that over lunch hour, you will have the opportunity to do that, as well as to meet with the panelists. We hope it puts you back in touch with the yearning of your hearts for the transformation of society, that it reminds you of past and still pertinent insights and experiences, and I hope opens up areas for further exploration. Pearl started today by encouraging us to carry the spirit here forward. I'd like to suggest, as we look around the room, that many of us have lived through this experience of the past, and maybe our greatest challenge is to how to influence future generations. So I leave that with you at the university, with the bishop, and with all of us, really. How can we contribute to the next generations catching the true spirit of the Second Vatican Council and the current synodal process? Thank you.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Rachel Brown, and I'm the Program and Research Coordinator at the Center. So I just thought I'd introduce myself quickly. So we're going to start with a ceremonial cake cutting, because I don't know how many folks in the room, you probably know this, but 100 years ago today is when Bishop Remi was born. So we are celebrating 100 years made better by Bishop Remi De Roo. So we are going to have some of Bishop Remi's cousins do a first ceremonial cut into the cake, and then we will all get to enjoy this cake for dessert for lunch. So we'll have the ceremonial cake cutting happen. It has a big 100 on the cake. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Remi. Happy birthday to you.
I think if we just remain seated and bow our heads. Bow our heads in gratitude for the gifts of this day, the gift of Bishop Remi De Roo, the gifts of all who are present here in community. We know that when we are gathered together, Jesus is in our midst, and especially when we break food and break bread together and eat, that we are sharing deeply in the mystery of communion. So let us ask God's blessing on this food and on all of us as we share it in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen.
I know we're all still really enjoying the fruits of that delicious lunch, but we need to keep to the timetable. Yay. Thank you. Thank you all. This afternoon's panel is titled Remi the Person. I've been asked to moderate it. My name is Diane Tolomeo. I used to teach English here at the university. I was in on some of the early meetings of the formation of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. I think a lot of what you're going to hear in this panel will be anecdotal, because the panelists have been asked how they know Remi, why they're here, why were they invited here. Maybe they still don't know that. And to just share how Remi impacted them personally. So we've heard a lot about how he impacted the church, the world, society, but I think he also impacted those of us who knew him, impacted us in personal ways. Anecdotes, things that other people might not know. Some things we can't share, obviously, but, and I want to start off very briefly with my earliest anecdote of Remi, and it was quite literally a wake-up call. I got a phone call before 7 o'clock one morning, asking me, this was about 40 years ago, maybe a little longer, asking if I would be on the board of the school board for the newly established regional high school. And of course I said yes, because I was barely awake, and it was the bishop. And I sort of knew who he was, but I guess people had given him names, and because I was connected with the university and he wanted somebody from education. So of course I said yes. He, years later, told me that was how he got people to do things. He said, I call them when I know they'll be home and I know they won't be awake. And I think probably maybe 9 times out of 10, people like me said, it's the bishop, yes. You know, I put on my dressing gown and say yes. So that was my first anecdote. The second was when Pearl and Remi and I were working on the Enneagram book, and we all got together to brainstorm and realized all 3 of us were Enneagram 1s. Perfectionists, those of you who don't know the scheme. And I asked Remi, how does it feel to be working with 2 other 1s? And he said, what could be better than working with 2 perfect women? So we got the book done. And my last anecdote, and this is the one that really hit me first, but I'm leaving it till last, was 2 words that Remi would say frequently every time I asked him this question. And the question was, how are you doing, Remi? And it was whether he had just broken a hip, or was sick, or was feeling good, or had had a party. I'd say, how are you doing, Remi? And he would say 2 words, can't complain. And you probably can hear his voice in there, can't complain. He had so much he could have complained about, but he never complained. He had many things to say, but they weren't complaints. So the biggest gift, I think, from Remi to me was my ability to incorporate that in my life and just say, can't complain. Okay, our first speaker today is Logan McMenamie. Some of you will know him well. He served as bishop Anglican bishop of the Diocese of Victoria or Vancouver Island?
Vancouver Island.
Vancouver Island. And met Remi in that capacity when he was working up in Tofino, like 40 years ago. And rather than read some of the information Logan gave me, I'm going to just let him talk about how he met Remi and the influence. So, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. Thank you, Pearl, and Doug, and Pat for the invitation to be here with you. And thank you to Paul and the team putting this all on today. I'm really honoured and privileged to be among you today and for you to give me some time to speak about my relationship with Remi, which does span over 40 years in various times and places. Since this has been recorded, isn't it? Okay, yeah. It's not Vancouver Island. Our colonial name was British Columbia, but the diocese is now called the Diocese of Islands and Inlets, just to get the record straight. But you did do well in my name. It's always a problem. So the story was that Bishop Jones, who was one of the bishops in the 80s in the Anglican Church, asked me to go through as a layperson to Ucula and Tofino and to look after the parishes in Ucula and Tofino. And during that time, we had a really good relationship with the Roman Catholic Church, with the parishes in both those places, mainly because of the sisters. Sister Anita and Sister Laura, and they were very much part of that, and we shared ministry across the parishes. And it was an evening, it was a fun get-together. And whatever matter was in my mind of meeting a bishop in this place was dispersed by meeting Remi. Because it was a fun evening in St. Francis's Parish Hall, and we were doing games and jokes, and somebody said, "Oh, the bishop's coming. The bishop's coming." Okay, and I expected some sort of fanfare, everybody stand up and applaud when the bishop came. No, I understand, I can't remember exactly, but I think he came from up north. I think it was a Howsett, and he came by canoe. Frank Salmon's a name some of you remember down there. That says a lot about him, and that doing a canoe with Frank Salmon. Anyway, the evening went on, and I said, "Where's the bishop? I thought he was coming. Where is he?" And somebody said, "Oh, he's here. He's been here for most of the evening." No fanfare, no great welcome. And I went over and I was introduced to Remi, who was sitting there quietly on a seat with a bunch of people, a bunch of the parishioners. And for me, that really established something about Remi I thought was really important. I saw through all of his life and reflected his ministry and his relationship with the diocese, with the church nationally, and that was a humility and a humanity. Humility and humanity, that he was just sitting there quietly enjoying those folk that was around about him. And I see that humility and humanity shaping him and shaping his character and his conduct, where that character and conduct was dealing with bishops, dealing with Rome, dealing with the government, and that shaped and formed him all the way through his ministry. My connection with Remi at that time was more that he became for me a model that I could shape my ministry after. Seeing him on the national stage, seeing him dealing with the social justice issues, working on the base ecclesial communities, all of that stuff really helped to shape and form me as a deacon, firstly as a layperson, but then as a deacon and as a priest within the Anglican Church. So after a while, I ended up seeing him on different occasions, coming across him, where that was an Anglican gathering where he was invited to speak, and I was invited to thank him at that time, which was wonderful. I remember that evening particularly, because I think that evening and me thanking him bonded a friendship. So from model to mentor and to friend. One of the times that humility came out was I met him in Conynear. Some of you remember Conynear Christian Books. And I met him there one day and I said to him, "Remi, it's good to see you. What are you doing?" "I'm going around teaching about Vatican II." That was it. I learned afterwards he was going all around the world teaching about Vatican II. And that same humility. I want to give briefly to talk his work with the Anglican Church, especially with bishops. I am the 8th Anglican bishop that ministered with Rennie. 8th Anglican bishop. And with all of them we had a special relationship and a different relationship. But 2, you'll remember the work that was done around social justice when the Premier would ask them to come in and sit down was Ronald Shepherd, who I was telling David that we called it the Ronnie and Remi show when they went around the diocese together. And especially the work he did, which was significant, not only in social justice with First Nations, and that was with Barry Jenks, and that work and that leadership within. Thank you. So that really shaped and formed until later on in my ministry when I became bishop. I've got much more to say about that, but when I became bishop, he respected and honoured my orders. So much so he would come up, he would ask me up at the end of events to say the final blessing with him. I mean, his birthday in Bethlehem, to come up and sit beside him and be honoured beside him. Very close to his death, I went to visit him in hospital. And I was taken up there and I spent some time with him in his room. I said a prayer with him and I gave him my blessing. After my blessing, he took my hand and he kissed my ring. Humanism to the very end, honouring other people's orders and other people's personality. Thank you for the opportunity to share those stories.
Thank you, Logan. It's going to be hard to get through this without crying. So feel free. I think there should be boxes of Kleenex on the tables. Our next speaker is Shauna Sylvester. Remi has been a close family friend, her and her parents. And again, I think I would rather than read what you gave me, just let you tell us about your relationship and how you remember him. Thank you.
It's always hard to follow a bishop. I want to start by saying I think Remi was a man of many questions. That doesn't mean he didn't live by his conviction. We all know that he definitely did. But there was something about the way he acted and presented himself that said, I'm not about stridency or moral lecturing. It wasn't, in his mind, the most effective way to proceed. So I met Remi when I was in grade 10. I had become the youth coordinator of the Ecumenical Center in Nanaimo in Trinity. Do we have other folks that were associated with the Trinity Center here? Yes, thank you. Now you have to imagine I have come out of a Catholic upbringing in Vancouver where I only know the true and apostolic church, and now I am attending both Catholic and United Church services. If it wasn't for Pearl guiding not only myself as a leader in the Trinity community, but my family, I'm not sure how that would have gone. I realized as I look back, I also wasn't an average 16-year-old. I really wanted to become a nun, and but I didn't want to just become a nun because I was kind of frustrated that the types of orders that I was introduced to could talk about schooling. You could be in hospital or services of the diocesan, and I was trying to figure out why there wasn't an order that was like Jesuits for women. So I really wanted to pursue scholarship and the study of justice, and I wanted to create an order. And in my very naive sense, I talked to Remi about that, and he encouraged me to consider situating it on Vancouver Island when I was ready. So those Nanaimo years opened the door to a lifelong friendship with Remi, and not just for myself, but with my family. And when I say lifelong, I mean lifelong. Remi and Pearl traveled with my parents around the world. I can't think of a place they didn't play bridge together. And even when my parents became sick and we moved them into assisted living, there was always a room and always a bed that was made up for Remi and Pearl when she would come Pearl, you got the living room pullout. I'm sorry about that. And when I say lifelong, I mean committed lifelong. When my mother, in her very advanced stages of Alzheimer's, stopped knowing who most of us were, Remi was there, telling her how much she was loved. When my father, through COVID, didn't want to let go and needed to let go, I would call Remi, and Remi would be there on the other end of the phone saying, Jerry, you can let go. Everything's okay. The kids are okay. We're all going to be okay. And Dad needed to know that Remi was going to be okay because he always felt he was going to outlive Remi. So no matter what it was, a 50th anniversary, a couple of weddings, a funeral, a packed Christmas Eve réveillon in my small living room with 25 odd family members, Remi was there. But to say he was a close family friend wouldn't actually do justice to the influence he had on my life. Although I wanted to be a nun, I couldn't reconcile my relationship to the church. My upbringing in New Westminster, I don't need to go into some of the things that young women went through, and in Bolivia and Quebec. And so I departed the church, and I found different avenues to express my beliefs. But Remi never let me off the hook. He would argue, whether we were in the front yard, in a bar, in a restaurant, that I was in the church. He said I'd never left it. I'd just gotten stuck in an institutional notion of the church. And while it may have misogynistic tendencies, it also supported me in my beliefs of peace, community, and social justice. Now, I've loved hearing about the ethical reflections on the economic crisis because I wrote a paper on that in my first year of university, and Remi figured large in that. And I remember at the time it already had 9 weeks in the media, and I had never seen anything like that in my life. So that was for me Remi, the activist in full flight. And I had a chance to get to know and collaborate with Remi, the activist, and with Pearl in the early years of the disarmament movement and the peace movement. These were the heady times of the peace movement when we would have the 5 minutes to midnight. Ambassador, you will remember that in terms of your own work on disarmament. These were also the times when so many countries were flexing their muscles, and the black market in fissile material was really out of control. Well, Remi was supported by you, many of you, in his parishioners in his diocese, and by his colleagues in Latin America to take an active role in advancing peace and nuclear disarmament. And it's one of the things I loved about Remi. He brought the social teachings of Christ alive and made it meaningful. Now, these were the days when you could get 100,000 people out for a peace march in Vancouver. It was in the 1980s I started to learn a lot more about liberation theology. I worked and lived in Bolivia and Ecuador, Mexico, Cuba. And I realized the extent to which Catholic nuns and priests were risking their lives to support the poor and disenfranchised of Latin America. It was also at a time I better learned about Remi as a spiritual leader who centered justice, peace, and a broader vision of the church. I began by saying that Remi was a man of questions. Now, having grown up surrounded by Jesuits, I was pretty used to hearing questions, a lot of questions. But Remi's questions emerged from a genuine curiosity. He really wanted to know what I was thinking and how I perceived the world. Now, growing up in a Catholic family with 3 brothers and attending a Catholic school for 10 of my 12 years, there were few occasions when I felt seen and heard as a woman. But Remi did see me. And I don't know if it was that he had always had a feminist view of the world, or if it was the strong women, Pearl, Sister Joyce, Sister Marie, who put time and energy into helping him understand the world, but he did embody and embrace a more holistic and inclusive view of the world, and one that challenged exclusivity in language and customs and created the space for women and diverse ways of knowing and seeing. As Remi aged and through all the difficulties that were thrown his way when he retired, I saw him grow stronger and more committed to justice and transformative change. As my work took me to conflict zones, I became dismayed by human rights abuses, corruption, and the speed of climate change. And yet Remi challenged me never to give up on my optimism. I remember when my husband Steve and I visited Remi a month before he died. He was restricted to his bed and living with some pain. That day, he spent 2 lucid hours with us in French, in English, in Spanish. He was sharp and deeply engaged, and he wanted to know that I wasn't going to give up. He was very much moved by the efforts of young people, and he said that the world needs transformative leaders who value the planet, who value people in our future. I look around this room, and I know that in this room are those leaders. I know Remi's with us, we've said that today, and I believe he's smiling. So I want to thank Pearl, Doug, Pat, the center, for bringing us all together here. Remi's words, his vision is very much alive. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Shauna. The third speaker this afternoon is Naz Rayani. Some of you will know him from his business involvement with the heart pharmacies and as a pharmacist, but he's here today in the capacity as a friend of Remi's. He was on the advisory board of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society in the early 90s when it was first getting going, and has been a friend of Remi's ever since, and I will let him tell you what that has meant to him.
Prophet Remi, can you hear me? I left my notes at home. So I'll do whatever is from my heart. Where do I begin? I was at the 85th birthday at UVic with Dr. Harold Coward and Jean Forrest and whatever. Don't know where to begin. Bishop Remi and I were on the advisory board of the CSRS in early 1990s. And I was proud to have shared my space with him. Remi really impressed me a lot at that time. Every time he used to come to Victoria from Nanaimo, he used to visit Jean Forrest and Rocky Forrest. And Jean and Rocky were my customers in Cadboro Bay. So Yasmin and I were invited every time at her house. And I knew from that time that this is not some ordinary guy. It's, yeah. I was at his funeral at the Mass. I was at the funeral at the cemetery. And a week later, I met Pearl. We shared the Muslim burials prayers like Al-Fatah. and he's buried not far from my home. I visit him maybe once a month, once a week, as often as I can. And I say my prayers. I do the tours to Smiley Center, Burnaby, Smiley Center, and 5 years ago, Bishop Remi was there, like some of the Peter and somebody were there, and I mean, quite a few of you guys have joined me on the tour. I became the World Partnership Walks convener, the third convener in 1994. And we didn't get too many broader community to attend. So I started this tour, and the first tour was Logan McMenamie's church, St. George's Church, in front of our pharmacy. Most of his customers, his clients were my customers. And should I tell the story? Logan's daughter used to deliver prescriptions for me. And some days they would come to Logan and say, "Dad, I'm busy. It's your client or your parishioner and my client." So Logan did the delivery. He was paid enough so that we didn't have to pay him. I knew he was getting paid. But Logan's family and my family were very close. We knew their daughters, and anyway. That's it, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Naz. I meant to say earlier that the title of today is The Prophetic Vision, and I mentioned that to somebody not here, and they said, "Well, don't prophets what's prophetic about Remi, and could he see the future?" And I just thought it worth saying that the real meaning of prophet, which I think we're probably all aware of, isn't someone who can see the future. It's the voice who speaks to the present. The voice of God speaking through the prophet to whatever situation it is, whether it's a public one or a social one or a personal one. So I just thought I'd say that. I don't know why. And the last speaker on our panel is Denise De Pap. She can tell you all the intricacies of her connection to the De Roo family. I know she is a double cousin. I wasn't sure what that was until she explained that her paternal grandmother was a De Roo before marriage, and Remi's mother was a De Pap before marriage. So this interlocking I will let you explain, and how it has affected your life.
And their farms were side by side. And my father is named Raymond after Remi's father, who was his godfather. So, like, the connections are. And pity me, I get to be the last speaker of the day. And I wanted to say thank you to everybody for honoring our cousin. There are four of us here, four or five of us. As Diane was supposed to say, I first met Remi in 1962 at his installation as bishop. A couple of weeks later, my family was invited back to Victoria for Christmas dinner at the bishop's residence. Remember the old house on View Street? Well, my grandmother, my father, my youngest brother, and I all got caught in the elevator. The door would not open. Remi, of course, remained calm, found somebody who could extricate us from the elevator on Christmas. And I noticed that he was particularly solicitous of my grandmother, and she was much comforted by him. She was his Aunt Marie. A little later, I put two and two together and realized they had a lovely relationship from the time that he was a priest in her parish of Holy Cross in Winnipeg. And he used to, in his priestly manner, ministry, he used to visit Grandma, who was his aunt, and her mentally and physically challenged sister who lived with her. She cared for this woman. That was his Aunt Augusta. So my first unspoken lesson from Remi was not just respect for elders, but the importance of doing kindness without making a big deal of it. My family moved to Toronto from Vancouver in 1964. Sometimes when Remi was in town, he would come for dinner. And after we got through the long conversation about who was in the hospital, who'd left the farm, who just had a baby, like there were a million cousins, we'd sometimes get onto really serious topics. I was in high school, and in my religion and ethics classes, learning about world peace and Vatican II and so on, I had lots of questions. Remi would always treat me as a valued family member, no condescension, like some of the other relatives. And I thought, aha, this wise and important man sees something in me that obviously the rest of the family was incapable of recognizing. But whatever, my self-confidence went up a notch. His promotion of the role of women in the church, and by extension the role of women in society, spoke volumes to me, even though it caused some disapproval in the De Roo De Pap clan. Why wouldn't he favor a bigger role for women? He had 5 wonderful, competent sisters. Then in the 1980s, and you've heard about this from several perspectives already, he caused a big splash. So I'll take you back to Swan Lake, a small farming community. His parents both emigrated as children in the 1890s. There were 9 De Roo and De Pap families in this community, aunts and uncles and cousins, close-knit traditional Catholic community. The aunts used to take note of who was not in church on Sunday so they could follow up later in the week. But this was also the community where Remi's father, Raymond, was on really friendly terms with all the Protestants in the neighborhood. That wasn't exactly considered, well, it was sort of unusual behavior, but I think it was a seed for something later in Remi's life. Although there was a lot of interaction and sharing in this community, it was considered unseemly, if not downright immoral, to do anything to call attention to yourself. Okay, so just imagine, open the newspaper, turn on the radio, and there's their native son questioning the federal government, talking about capitalism and unions and the economy. That sure set the tongues wagging and the head shaking. I have to admit that it caused me to shake my head a little bit too, partly because my parents weren't totally in sync with his views or his approach. But for me, it was paradigm shifting. This was the first time I heard somebody, certainly somebody in the family, speak truth to power. And this and other instances, when he took public positions based on conviction and deep knowledge, inspired me. So I knew he had my back when I participated in a very public campaign and press conference with other health professionals designed to embarrass the University of Toronto into divesting their shares in tobacco and to remove tobacco CEOs from their board of governors. We even called out my own alma mater, St. Michael's College, at the U of Toronto for accepting tobacco industry money to mount a social responsibility program for business people. Like, shake your head. This was, of course, before Shauna's brother was president of St. so you can tell him. When I spoke to Remi about this, I said, Remi, this is a page out of your book. And he just smiled. He was supportive of my whole public health career. He called it my civic leadership. And certainly supportive of my focus on the reduction of harm due to alcohol and other drugs, including tobacco. His sense of justice and recognition of the intrinsic value of people helped strengthen my own commitment to health promotion, which was the principal guiding philosophy of all my work in 2 provinces. I often thought of his remark that we don't judge and we don't blame. That's where we start. And he said this when asked about how you deal with the homeless people outside the cathedral. I realized that we were essentially doing similar work in different ways and at different levels. He practiced on a spiritual and emotional level, and I was more focused on the conditions of daily living. Nevertheless, it gave us lots of cause for conversations, particularly after I moved to Victoria for a job in 2008. I never heard Remi criticize anyone. Not only not even the family members who persisted in the myth that he was lazy, shirked his responsibility, and was spoiled by his mother. That started when he was a kid, a sickly kid who picked up everything, and he got excused from some of the hard farm labor once in a while. But of course, all the other cousins, the boys particularly, they were all kind of jealous. But I mean, my cousins and I have heard this said when the name of Remi comes up, even as we're adults. It's crazy. His non-critical, and you know what? That may come from the fact that one of the directives from his father when the family was growing up was to never speak in anger. I think he really embodied that, didn't he? So his non-critical nature was apparent one particular time. I was ranting, not particularly charitably, I have to say, about Cardinal Ratzinger having been elected as new pope. How could those cardinals choose that man? Did they know what they were doing? So Remi paused, said, I know Cardinal Ratzinger. As a matter of fact, I've been on the carpet in front of him to defend my actions. He looked at me and he said, Denise, this is a man who comes more from here than from here. And then he proceeded to explain to me how this attitude that Ratzinger was known for might have arisen. He said all of this with no judgment, no rancor, no bitterness. A huge lesson for me. I was privileged to spend time with him in his dying weeks and was touched by the way he modeled dying with grace and acceptance. During this sacred time, he spoke so often about family members, and his love for family, whether we were first cousins or 10th cousins, was so apparent. He even told me stories about my own aunts and uncles that I'd never heard before. So I got many lessons and many gifts from my 62-year relationship with my friend and cousin Remi. I've given you a sort of picture of him as seen through the eyes of one family member. Others would have different stories. But I just want to say thank you again for coming on behalf of the family. Happy birthday, Remi. We miss you.
Thank you for that, Denise. Often when, in fact very frequently, when Remi would have heard of the death of a friend whom we knew or someone from afar, or I would say to him, did you hear that so-and-so had died? His reply would be the same, another friend in heaven. And so Remi is now another friend in heaven. And to conclude this panel, do you have the poem with you? Okay. Logan has written a poem called A Voice to Be Heard, and I believe you read it at the funeral, or you haven't. Okay. I felt like I had heard it before, but oh, it was read. Okay, pardon me. It was. So some of you will have heard it, but it's worth hearing a second time. So thank you.
A voice to be heard. From Manitoba you came, priest and Bishop Benjamin to the church. Transformation, tables upset with grace and love. Progressive, cathedral reflection, university foretold. Vatican II born. Sisters and brothers, family strengthened, not profits or gain, human needs and pain. Teacher, synod for all, consistent, refrain, borders reshaped, newness and reform. Vatican II lives. In the silence, an echo heard, a reformer speaks. Those who have ears to hear, unsettle foundations, receive compassion, gentleness and calm, humility and grace. The poor given, new chance. The voiceless speak. Vatican II lives. A voice of a prophet, a voice of a pastor. In every community, on a national stage, social justice declared. For practices proclaimed, ecumenical emissary, friend and mentor, communicator, justice and peace. Vatican II lives. National, international, plane and car, boat and canoe, community and care, welcome and warm, liturgy renewed, form and function, walls removed. Vatican II lives. Today we say goodbye and thanks for all you gave, all you were, for courage, a voice leading, reforming, reshaping, renewing, community, church. Because of you, Vatican II lives.
Be prepared to be asked for copies of that. So that concludes this portion of the day. What comes next? Yes, yes. Naz forgot something. Yes.
In 2010, I had a health issue, and I remember Bishop Remi De Roo phoning my family, giving prayers. And then Logan McMenamie was a bishop of St. Michael, no. No. Christchurch Cathedral. Anyway, my family tells me that he had a vigil for prayers for me. and I'm standing now because of your prayers. Thank you.
My name's Pat Jamieson. Yes, I am Christine's brother. Few people couldn't quite believe that, but Doug told me not to talk too long, so I better keep moving here. No, I'm just kidding. I guess we could think of another 107 people or whatever the number is that would have liked to have been here. Some of them aren't alive anymore. So I just wanted to mention, I'm having trouble with this, with Marnie Butler's passing. She would have loved to have been here. I'll just tell one anecdote that she repeated often. She became a Catholic in the late 80s, so, but she'd always noticed this figure of Bishop De Roo. And when she grew up in Victoria, and she used to go to Monroe's books, and Alice Monroe used to sell her a few books, but then say, well, you can't really afford this as a teenager, so why don't you go over to the library? So she'd go to the library, which was right by the cathedral, the Carnegie Library, and then she'd have the ones from Monroe's, and then she always felt welcomed or comfortable sitting in the back of the cathedral, looking the books over before she went home. And there was this little priest that used to come up and made her feel very welcome. And later she recognized him from the television appearances as Bishop Remi. So he was her little priest. Anyway, the reason I'm here is that 20 years ago we published a long essay on Bishop De Roo in the Avant-Garde, the Prophetic Catholicism of Remi De Roo. And I did a national tour with it, just the way things worked out. Got as far as Halifax, I remember. When I was in Montreal, Christine had organized at Thomas More Centre to have a panel reacting to the books. So they'd all been sent copies. She was teaching in Montreal, my sister. And Gregory Baum was one of the panelists, and I happened to be standing outside waiting before the event. And Gregory I recognized, and he was crossing the street, and a number of women, I remember they were in a group, they called out to him, Gregory, have you read this book? And he said, oh yeah. And I'm on a panel, and they said, well, is there any of Bishop De Roo's speeches or talks in it? And he said, no, it's a journalistic book. And that struck me almost sort of, and I thought, how could I write a book about Remi without including any of his talks? But it would have been twice as thick. Anyway, that's just entree to the fact that we now have a book of Remi's talks done by Pearl and Doug, and I was around there somewhere. So I just want to turn it over to Pearl. We have this new, wonderful, lovely book that fills that gap. And I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but I think we're looking for someone to do what I call a real biography. So if there's anybody in the audience who wants to volunteer, let us know. But anyway, I turn it over to Pearl, and she'll talk about the book. It's a beautiful thing, both physically and content-wise. Thanks.
Hello again. Are you feeling different now than you did this morning? So am I. It has its advantages, but it's not very easy to talk about a book that you put together. And some of you know that. It's a very humbling experience to then hold up a book that is out there and makes me feel exposed. And I don't want anybody to think, as my mom would say, Pearl, you don't think yourself smart. And but what is wonderful about this particular book is that I want to proclaim it on the rooftops. because they are not my words. Not that my words aren't important sometimes, but this is Remi's book, of his words, of his thoughts, of some of his thoughts, some of his feelings, some of his experiences. But it's also your book. Because as someone said to me earlier this morning, and I very much appreciate it, was this is about Remi's mission, and she said, it's also about our mission. And I want to highlight that to make it clear that this is our mission to proclaim the goodness of the divinity, the goodness of creation, and especially the goodness and beauty and essence that live in each one of us. Remi had a very favorite section in Vatican II, known as Article 22 in Gaudium et Spes. And it went something like this, that when Jesus took a body, took our flesh, that he really raised up all of humanity and honored the flesh, and what the flesh can do, enhanced by the spirit and hard work and grace and effort. And it goes on to say that Jesus thought with a human mind. He worked with human hands, and he felt with a human heart. In other words, we have become raised up because of who we are as human beings. And it doesn't matter what tradition you talk about, there's this super level, there's this energy, there's marvelous, marvelous gift in each one of us that only we can explain with our words, with our actions. And so when Remi spoke, people listened, didn't they? They really listened. Partly because he had a lot to say, and what he had to say was powerful. But we also listened, I think, this is my experience, because I knew that when I spoke, he listened. This was not a one-way street. And so when you, Marie, mentioned this morning that it's not just Remi's mission, this mission belongs to all of us. And so I'm offering you some of Remi's words in that context. One of the stories I'd like to tell you is about how we started on this book. Remi, and no, not Remi, he'd gone by this time. Paul and Pat and Doug asked for a meeting, I think it was Doug, and asked me to go because of the function I held at the time. And so we went, and that was the time that the issue of finding a biographer came up. And I personally, because of the role I had, I personally felt it was too early. You don't start telling a story right away after people pass. You start celebrating, not necessarily writing their biography. And you also have to take time to mourn, to do your own passing. This was not the time. However, as time went on, we're talking, it's only 2 years ago that Remi passed. And by the way, in his book, I had to correct it because I had the poor man dead a year before. Anyway, you're going to see the right dates in these books because, Vicki and I corrected all of them. But but it became very clear that something had to be written. There was an energy in the air, and I remember Diane and I, the perfect team, kind of saying out there's a book that's just saying you have to write it. You write me, and I've got to be written. And this was one of them. This is one that was out there in whatever land saying you've got to write us. And we went through a series of, I looked for researchers and got money ready, just like I did with the Bible, you have to find money, right? And so that quite didn't happen, and it ended up, there were two people that I really wanted to write this book, but had other things to do. Two of them are sitting here in this area, in this room. And so I really felt compelled is what I felt, that it had to be written, and if it had to be written, maybe I better just be at it. So I did, with the help of a lot of people. We put together, Doug and Pat and I put together, along with some other folks in this community, what were the main themes that Remi spoke about, that Remi lived. And so we came with about 12. And as I was going through, thousands of Remi's sheets of paper and all his talks, we developed, I think, into about 18. But I want to tell you how Remi often started. Are you okay if I talk this way? Just kind of talk. Thank you. And so I would do it anyway. Anyway, he would often start his talks, let's say to the Pulp and Paper National Organization. I mean, everybody asked Remi to speak. The Anglican Synod had Remi a couple of times. The United Church in Toronto had him. The Catholic Women's League had him in 1969 or whatever. And he told them that women's issues was a big issue that the church had to deal with. That was in 1969. So every once in a while, when he himself, it would seem, didn't really know why he was asked to speak, and he would start his talk every once in a while with, I'm sure that some of you are wondering why a Catholic bishop is standing here speaking to you at this conference. And they would shake their heads. They would shake their heads, and he would say, he didn't say, well, I don't know either, but he'd tell them why he was speaking. He said, this is why I'm speaking. I follow a man who wanted justice for all workers. I follow a man who was compassionate. I follow a man who wanted us to love. I follow a man who wanted us to be happy, to ensure that we had everything we needed to lead a good human life, along with principles and values that were imperative to have in building a just society and having, he didn't use these words at this time, a common home for which we share and love. That is why he would speak to people. And it was amazing how, as I went through the thousands of pages of his talks, and Darlene, if you're here, you know somehow the number of times, I don't know whether Darlene's left or not, that he didn't have a researcher. He didn't have me. He had McBane periodically, and the team there that helped. But he did this along with caring for his own diocese in many pastoral ways. So his words in the original, the working title that we did with his words were in his own words. So what I am going to do is read you a few of what my favorite lines are. And one of the things about choosing his words is that I had to be very careful myself not to choose the statements I liked necessarily and left the others, but what is it that Remi wanted to have people hear? So I hope that this is what happened. I'm going to start with one that is quite controversial. And I chose this particular section because it may be controversial, but as I looked at the world today, and as I hear some of my friends comment about the world today, there's a sense that the other is supposed to be invisible, not seen, not heard. The homeless on the street, Yeah, don't look at them while you wander around. The immigrants come in, no, let's not look at them. The people who are gay and lesbian are trying to figure out who they are. They're not doing the right thing. We won't look at them. We'll discard them. There is a sense of the other being discarded and being abolished, totally abolished from this planet. And I probably am in that section in terms of being a woman that speaks. And there are other people in this room who may also feel that in some ways society right now wants to be selective in who they live with and who they see and who they love and what values they have. So I want you to just read this paragraph to you. But it won't be the only one. Remi had been talking before this particular paragraph about the importance of having a good life, a home under your head. Some of them do have them under your head. Over your head, and food, and clothing, and education, and love. He was just speaking about that. For those of you who have a book, if you want to follow, fine, but feel free to listen. It's on page 146. It is becoming increasingly apparent to me that we cannot require that people live according to certain moral standards if we do not provide the conditions within which that sort of life is possible, where people have an opportunity to make truly moral choices. In other words, there's a relationship between oppression, justice, sheer frustration at the lack of minimum human standards and moral issues like abortion, conjugal violence, substance abuse, and so on. We have a responsibility to provide the kind of human support structures and community that allow people to live moral lives. Many people who are accused of breaking one moral law or another feel they have no choice. The irony is that the very people who are the most insistent on morality are the least interested in providing the conditions of social justice. They react very strongly against what Cardinal Bernardine called the seamless garment of morality, meaning that you can isolate an individual issue like abortion from the larger social context. My understanding of the pastoral experience is that no woman wants an abortion as such. It's contrary to her basic life attitude. But when it's a case of economic and psychological survival for a single parent with several children, abortion appears to become a logical solution. How dare we blame the individual for a situation created by a society which is not prepared to provide the social matrix of support, the affirmation, the comfort and human conditions of living that makes morality possible. He grasped that sense of what is just and it's not, and what is the gospel? The gospel is to live and ensure that all of us are loved and cared for and respected. So I thought that was quite, it could be controversial, but it's so important that the other does not disappear. Another paragraph following this. In keeping with the renewed understanding of the Second Vatican Council, every member, Remi was big on the local church, wasn't he? And he was so big on every member. It's not just the Pope or the Bishop or the President of Knights of Columbus. It was each one of us that is so equal in dignity and capacity to serve. That's who Remi knew we were, and that's who he knew he was. So it's the Second Vatican response. See, this is what happens to me. That's what happens when I would read his paragraphs. I'd immediately start going Pearl stuff instead of Remi stuff. Excuse me, Remi. And he'd say, that's all right, just keep on. And so he called on every member of the local community is considered an adult and mutually co-responsible for the attainment of the above goals. In other words, not only the hierarchy, but every baptized member shares in Christ's mission of priest, prophet, and king. And we all, every person, whether a member of the community of Christians or not, is called to build up society and has a responsibility to all members of the community. And I think this is one of the reasons why many organizations asked him to speak, because they felt, now this is my sense. I don't know about you, but when I find someone that I admire, I want to emulate that person. I want to not necessarily be that person, but I want to be like that person and learn something from that person. And I felt as I was going through the papers that the people were asking him to speak because they knew that he had values that they also had. And that when they saw him, they had a wonderful piece of information about their own values. So in many ways, I think speaking to them and seeing that he was respected, that they themselves started to say, you know, I can do this. I know how to do this. So those are a couple of the paragraphs, but again, they're Remi's words, and I think we could have wonderful book clubs and that sort of thing, looking at each chapter and saying, you know, what do I think about what he said about women? What do I think about what he said about youth? How can I emulate this? I'm going to end there, and if there are any questions, do you want to do the questions now? Oh, after Doug? Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pearl, for a very moving presentation and everything that you've done. A lot has been said today about Remi De Roo in the context of the Second Vatican Council. I think it's probably true that I'm the only person in the room who actually attended the Second Vatican Council, which gives you an indication of my age. I attended it as a journalist, but it was not at the Vatican Council that I met Remi. It was immediately afterwards when I came to Edmonton at the request of the Archbishop of Edmonton at the time to found a new Catholic paper, the Western Catholic Reporter. And when I had moved to Edmonton, I soon began to hear about this new, young, dynamic bishop in Victoria, Remi De Roo. And the paper that I edited had a series of lectures called Vatican II and You, which was presented immediately after the close of the Vatican II in December '65. And so in the winter of 1966, we had 12 speakers come, and I invited Bishop Remi De Roo, and that was the first time I met him when he came to Edmonton. Well, he made a hit with the audience, as you can imagine. And we began to talk, and I said, well, Bishop, I'd like to talk a bit more to you, with you. So he invited me to come to Victoria, talk to him, and thus I did. I was his guest at his home he lived then on Arbutus Road. And we began to talk. The first of many conversations that we had. And Shauna, you said a few minutes ago, you felt that you were seen by Bishop De Roo. And I took that to mean that you were seen as a woman, you were seen. You were seen for who you were. I want to tell you that I felt that I was seen by Bishop Remi De Roo. He was a layman's bishop. It was remarkable that we held conversations and I felt myself free to speak about what I thought about the church. And we talked about the two great documents of Vatican II, the Constitution on the Church and the Constitution on the Church in the modern world. And the Constitution on the Church is centered around the people of God. The definition of the church is the people of God. Instead of this pyramid, a circle. And that's how we began to see one another. Remi was remarkable as a bishop to be able to infuse the person he was speaking with the idea that they actually had something to say and were important too. And so I got my courage, and we talked a lot about the church and many things about it. And of course the Constitution of the Church in the modern world is centered around its opening phrase: the griefs and anxieties, the joys and sorrows of the people suffering are the griefs and anxieties, the joys and sorrows of all those who are Christians. And those remarkable words at the core of the Constitution of the Church in the modern world are what emboldened me to go ahead with my own life. And Remi De Roo never said to me, "You ought to go into politics." He never said that. But he gave me the strength to move my own life into the public arena, which I did. And it is quite true that Remi De Roo was certainly, God help him, he bears some responsibility for what I started to do in the political arena in life. So we went on a bit, and the idea occurred to us, since we were having these conversations, to do a book, a dialogue between a bishop and a layman. It was unheard of in those days. I mean, I wouldn't exactly say it as equals, but I mean, but the semblance of equality was certainly there, because we were part of the people of God. So we did this book. It was called Man to Man Dialogue, and it was published in 1969, and hardly anybody ever heard of the book, largely because the publisher, a Catholic publisher named Bruce Publishing, shortly thereafter went out of business, which was a forerunner of what happened to a lot of the Catholic media in the post-conciliar years. So the years went by, and in 1987, Remi celebrated his 25th anniversary as a bishop. They had among other things, they had a wonderful mass in St. Andrew's Cathedral, and Bishop Alec Carter, you talked to Michael about Emmett Carter, but Bishop Alec Carter then was the president of the Canadian Conference, and the altar was filled with bishops who came to his honor, and the church was filled with people. And Alec Carter got up and gave a speech, and he said, "Well, here we have all the bishops who have come to honor their brother bishop, and all the people of Victoria have come to show their love for their bishop." And the place erupted in applause. That was the feeling, I think, that the people of of Victoria wanted to convey at that moment. It was a highly emotional moment that transpired and showed that for all the difficult subjects that Remi De Roo tackled, much to the chagrin of some of the bishops, as Michael has recounted, that they loved him. Certainly the core of the bishops did. They respected him, and that is something that I think should be brought out. Years went by, and in 1992, Remi and I were out for a walk one day. We said, you know, we got to do that book again. Man to man. No, Remi, we can't call it man to man. We're going to have a woman in it. So it's very chauvinistic. But anyway, I said, we need to complete the people of God in this thing. So we invited Mary Joletti to come out, and we spent a week in the midst of a Victoria snowstorm in Remi's, at that time, then the new pastoral center where we lived. And we had a wonderful week in which the dimension that Mary Joletti was able to bring in infused the book. And that book was called, and it was published in 1992, and was called In the Eye of the Catholic Storm. And it was received pretty well by people who I think were interested in Vatican II. But I have to say that some of the Catholic media were somewhat distressed, I put it mildly, at the idea that a bishop would lower himself to talk to two people out here, and that they would dare to talk back to him, and that we would give our views, and they weren't too keen on all that. Remi just rolled with it all. So that was In the Eye of the Catholic Storm. That was my second literary encounter, so to speak, with Remi. My third came in 2012 when Remi decided to do the book, which was ultimately published, called Chronicles of a Vatican II Bishop. And Pearl and I, and Diane Tolomeo, and Pat Jamieson, who did a little collaboration. And that book was produced, and it's a pretty good book, in which Remi tells his own story, the fullness of that story. And now I have the honor, the pleasure to be associated with, in my fourth literary endeavor, with Remi on this very wonderful book that Pearl has just described. And this book is called Remi De Roo, Pilgrim and Prophet. There was some discussion here earlier about these words. I would just like to recount for a moment that when we talk about the Pilgrim, that this book is centered on Remi and the Second Vatican Council, which was a transformational moment in the long history of the Church. It set the people of God on a journey to rediscover who we are as baptized Christians and what are our responsibilities to a suffering world. This is the pilgrimage Bishop Remi De Roo led primarily in the Diocese of Victoria, but also throughout Canada and other regions of the world. Thus, the word pilgrim in the title. Remi was a pilgrim. We discussed prophet. What is a prophet? What is a prophet? A prophet is a person regarded as an inspired teacher or proclaimer of the will of God, who reads and discerns the signs of the times and who seeks to comfort God's people. Bishop De Roo proclaimed the teachings of Vatican II as a source for living the gospel, and he proclaimed the Church for how it should be seen in the modern world. That's the inspiration that I drew from Remi De Roo. Jamieson a moment ago talked about a forthcoming biographer of a book, of the full life, the entire life. Not just the political dimensions, but the spirituality. How he moved into the core idea of the power of what Jesus taught us about peace and about love and strength and human dignity and respect. What a lesson he gave. The fullness of that needs some time. And so I think that just as Vatican II itself needs the unfolding of history to come, to grasp, let alone implement, its full meaning, we have not yet arrived at that time. And just as that is true, so too is it true that we need more time, and history needs more time, to evaluate the full life of Remi De Roo. He was a giant who brought a spirituality into the lives of those who connected with him in the most profound and lasting way. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was beautiful. So we have now about a half an hour for some broader community conversation. Before we do that, though, we'll do what we did before with microphones around the room. Before we do that, though, several people have asked Michael if they might get a copy of his wonderful lecture this morning. If you're interested in that, Rachel and Noriko are keeping a piece of paper over there on the main desk, so please sign up on that, and we'll hook you up with Michael's blog. Yeah, Scott.
Yeah, my name is John. There's a question I want to pose. Everybody, Remi was invested with authority and power by position. What happens in the crucible of life when people have authority and power and they don't have the choice between what's right and what's wrong, or good or bad, but between what is bad and what is worse? How did Remi deal with excruciating, extremely difficult decisions that he had to make?
Good question.
Where is his spirituality engaged in that?
I think there are microphones. There's actually microphones you can share, like a handheld mic right there.
Well, thank you very much. I hear your comment with great respect, but I don't fully agree with your premise that life is full of choices that are either bad or worse. And politicians, I guess you're referring to public life, are confined to that. They're not confined to it. They have the Charter of the United Nations to begin with. I mean, umbrella over that cover a whole lot of situations today, whether we're talking about economic and social development, arms control and disarmament, environmental protection, or human rights. I mean, you've got the Charter there. It's a question of whether political leaders will exercise their will. They're caught up today in we're going through a sort of a revisionist period in history when we're reverting back to animal instincts of warfare instead of aspiring to what the United Nations pointed the way forward for us in fostering institutions to build and protect security in all its human dimensions of security. So we're suffering today from a great lack, a dearth of political leaders who have both the intellect and the spine to move forward. So to that extent, I agree with what you said. I think you're feeling a lack of good leadership. But that's what I got from your question. And but it's not that they don't have a choice. It's they feel that the pendulum of history is moving away from a basis of cooperation for human life, and that we're going to have to live with confrontation. It disturbs me deeply. I'm writing about it these days. It disturbs me deeply. But I think that we who are here in this room can never cease saying we can and must do better, and there is a way forward. And to be practical about it, the way forward is centered in the Charter of the United Nations.
Is this on? Yes. John, I'd like to just briefly respond to how did he deal with this in terms of spirituality. Diane mentioned earlier that, one morning when she was awakened at 7 o'clock in the morning by Remi, probably before that he had had an hour of prayer and already gone for a walk. And when he was going through some difficult situations, and many of his friends and acquaintances, Kevin indeed, would know, when people asked him, how do you go through this? And he would say, among other things, he'd say, well, I follow a man who was crucified. And why should I, as a loyal disciple of his, not have some suffering time? So he felt, he also, though, was not depressed about it, saddened, but very, very hopeful. Remi maintained a spirit of optimism, and he kept in a spirit of hope and of trust. He knew that this story was not about him. This is the story about a community, trying to build a community of love and of care, but we're human. So he trusted every one of us through his difficulties and through our difficulties.
Other questions? Sorry.
I just want to respond from a slightly different perspective. Because I heard the question more as coming from an individual, not from a leader or not from a politician, and that many individuals are faced with that dilemma of having to make a choice in real life situations of what they may have been told or they experience as bad and worse. But it seems that they don't have another option given their circumstances. And so I just wanted to bring out the teaching of the Second Vatican Council about the role of conscience, which Bishop De Roo, of course, never ceased to kind of remind us of that.
Yeah, I heard John's question is much more existential. And I think that I heard lots of stories about Bishop De Roo, like going down to Central America, stepping out in faith, getting in situations where he might not have come back alive. But my own bias, anybody that's talked to me for more than 10 minutes realized that faith, stepping out in faith, in every existential situation we're in, there's a moment when we can pull back or we can step out. Psychologically, I've relied on Carl Jung in terms of that, because he based his whole life really on this idea that if we make things conscious on an archetypal level, and I saw Remi do this all the time, and faith is a fantastic way to do that, stepping out in those critical moments, then it transforms the situation. And we have to expect that. We can't expect, as Remi used to say, I'll just end on this, you don't solve problems at the level of the problematic. Somehow you have to have a faith mechanism to move it to another level of consciousness. And I just saw him manifesting that time and time again. Bob Dylan used to say in his movies, his buddy would be saying, let's go and hear this guy, and Dylan would say, has he got anything to say? I never heard Remi speak once when he didn't have something to say, when he didn't transform my consciousness about the whole thing by his structural analysis or his really deep faith perspective. Anyway, that's what came to mind from what I heard, John.
Thanks. I think there's a question over here. Peter.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Peter Baltudis. I teach at St. Mary's University in Calgary, and this has been a fantastic day, so I've enjoyed it thoroughly. So my question is both for Pearl and for Douglas. You both knew Bishop Remi De Roo fairly well. You then spent lots of time researching all of his previous lectures and his talks and really engaged his writings and ideas in a different way. So my question to both of you is, what did you learn in compiling this book? What did you learn about Bishop De Roo that you did not know, perhaps, or maybe didn't appreciate about him, but then you came to really understand him better through these writings? Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Wonderful question, thank you. I knew Remi for 67 years. And one of the things, I learned many things as I was going through his material. I learned that in many ways I didn't know a thing about him. I just found so much more than I had ever known about him in terms of his energy and the amount of time and energy and intellect and ability to put things in words and put them in words that would motivate and inspire people and challenge them. I mean, I knew that at some level in my many years of working with him, but it just took me to a different level of appreciating the importance of people's words and actions, regardless of what they were. So I learned to know Remi ever so much more. The other thing I learned through it was just how hard and passionate he was about the gospel and about Vatican II. And you will notice in the book that each part starts with an excerpt. Each part starts with an excerpt from the gospel, that it talks about, growing up, toss away childish things from Paul. Speaking about something from the Vatican Council documents that really motivated him to take part in a very active way, not just as a bishop of the magisterium, so to speak, but as a citizen of the world. And that he integrated those teachings in a way that propelled him. It propelled him just so passionately into his mission of building up the world, building the world in love. So what I learned about him was affirmed and enhanced. And also, I forget your name.
Peter.
Okay, thank you. I was also very proud of him. As a friend, I was very proud and happy that I had had the opportunity, as most all of us have had, to have known this giant and to have been seen by him. I mean, I'm with Sean and many others in terms of the work that he did for women and how that is going to keep moving. So to be seen, I also felt very humble. Not everybody has a chance to meet giants in their life. And we have. And we must continue to build a new world, not that it's old, but to renew it and to claim it as being beautiful and wonderful so we can all live happily.
So it's a very humble experience.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that? No? Okay. Other questions? Can I take it? Yeah, Shauna. Oh, wait, hang on one sec. Rachel's got the mic. Thank you. Thanks, Rach.
It's in that vein, Pearl, I want to ask a question, because we're going through a time historically where people moved by normative values are being attacked. And this isn't, I mean, if we look at all of the trends, whether it comes from Davos or it comes from our own futuristic policy horizons, what we know is that that attack is going to increase and become much more a part of our day-to-day reality. So that those that stand behind liberal values of human rights, of peace, of social justice, will become the thin edge of the wedge of targeting.
Say that again, Shauna.
They will become the thin edge of the wedge of targeting. That what if you study foreign policy, if you've worked in this space, you know that this has been going on for years, but it's going to have a much more targeted piece, and that's all of the research of the last 12 months is coming out and saying this is the new reality. So I think of a Remi and what he went through, and I think that that's only a fraction of what's going to happen for those that take very strong normative, very strong value-centered. And I wonder what we can learn to inoculate against that. And I guess this is the part, I'm even going back to the very first panelist and our very first speaker around community and the inoculation that happens when you're part of something bigger. But I want us to be realistic of what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And situated in the United States, you see that even more pronounced.
Thanks, Shauna.
Yeah, well, Shauna, thank you. That's a very deep area that you're opening up. We are living through a disruptive moment in world history. And coming out of World War II, when what we call now the international order, or the international system, centering around the United Nations, was founded, and we lived in hope. And particularly when the end of the Cold War came in 1989, and for the first time the leaders of the Security Council all came together in person. And it was in 1992, and it was a high moment in human civilization, but it fell apart by the continuation of wars of various kinds. And I use the following word with great accuracy: the pusillanimity of the leaders of the day, who did not seize the moment to move our society forward with more equitable forms of economic and social management policies. And so then there came a revolt, a reaction against it, more wars, and then now we've entered into what's called the Trumpian period. Trump is not the author of all this; he's just a beneficiary of a turn of events in the world at which people have lost a number of people, a not insignificant number of people, have lost hope that they can count in world political structures. So that we're living through this reaction, and people are losing hope, and as I said a moment ago, we are reverting to a war mentality, where militarism, the forces of militarism in all its aspects, are now re-dominating foreign policy instead of the other way around, that foreign policy built on the ideals and issues of the United Nations, the equality issues of the United Nations, giving way to this call for a stronger military as the answer to our problems, as if we haven't learned. So we're going through a deep, what I call a deep valley right now in the movement of the world, in the long range movement of the world from a culture of war to a culture of peace. We've left behind actually the culture of war. We're not living in the 20th century where 2 world wars claimed 100 million people lives. We're not there. Nor have we moved into a real culture of peace in which there is a full recognition of the principles and values set out by the UN Charter. So we're in a transition. So a lot of people lost hope. I just wrote a book and I called it "Keep Hope Alive." And how do you keep hope alive? Hope is not something that's out there. If I do say, we'll find some hope. Hope comes from our own actions. We have to have a strength within ourselves to move forward in particular. Right? Not everybody can do everything. Not everybody can be a Secretary General of the United Nations. Each of us has an opening in our own lives. I often describe my own life as I feel that I'm a small grain of sand on a very big beach. But it's not unimportant. So it's the exercise of our will to move forward. And I think that we here, particularly in this room, who have as a basis for our guidance and our spiritual strength the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, which are extremely important. And I just pointed to 2 essential documents, the Church and the Church of the Mother World, that strengthen us, that give us the intellectual and the strength, the spiritual basis on which we can connect ourselves and rebuild the human community. That's what we're challenged to do. We cannot stop and give up just because there's a whole lot of messy things going on in the world.
There's a
Thank
question
you.
here.
We're so fortunate to have Doug with us.
Mm-hmm.
So fortunate. I'd like to add to Doug, Doug, you were great, but I want to say something else too. I really feel that now is, to pick up your point, the place where we have to practice hope. It's not just hope. Sometimes we feel depressed when we listen to the news and whatever, and we have to intentionally practice hope. It is a practice. It's not just something that comes all by itself. Just like loving sometimes doesn't come by itself. We have to practice it. The other piece I think is crucial, and that is that we get away from this individualistic world in which we live and find communities, build and treasure and initiate small communities. I just look at the St. Anne Sisters and your living and witnessing community and what you have done in social justice in terms of witnessing hope and trust. So the community, we have to find people. We have to find people not necessarily who are like-minded. Find people that are different from ourselves. And what are they thinking? What is dear Sunny down the street, who's the mama to a street group, what is she thinking? What does she want? Trust these people. Trust ourselves. Build communities as best we can. And it's going to be hard, but you know what? We have to do it. And it's a challenge, and we want a challenge.
Thanks, Pearl.
Shauna.
I think we have time for one last question.
I'm Yvonne Zarowny, for those of you who don't remember from this morning. I guess I disagree with you, Doug. And I agree with you, Pearl, in terms of that we need to go forward in hope. However, I know for myself, I have been going through an incredibly dark time. And I am tired of Knights of Columbus, who are supposed to know our church teachings, calling me a socialist, a communist, and a Marxist because I'm trying to educate my parish about Catholic social teachings. and I suggest that they might want to look, and these accuse me of reading all these leftist kinds of books, and me and my leftist books. And so I suggested that they might want to look at Wikipedia, particularly around people like Carl Anderson, who for 22 years was the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus. And so I think we need to, something that I felt has been lacking in things, so is war is very profitable. We live in a capitalist society. So as long as we live in a capitalist society and war is very profitable, we're going to have wars. And war is not healthy for the environment, it's not healthy for animals or birds or people. And so somehow, how do we move the conversation out of, and look, somebody mentioned about looking at realities. Well, we need to look at these realities and get a new model of engagement, because what we've been doing for the last 50 years is really wonderful, really good, and it's to be celebrated. Could we learn from it and evolve something new? Because what has worked isn't working now, and they got our number. And as the young woman here said, is that we're going to be targeted. I am being targeted, and it gets uncomfortable. And I'm not part of a religious community, so I don't have that kind of background. I'm an individual, and so when you get attacked by your priest and questioned by your priest and by the Supreme Knight, and you get them around to agreeing with me, but it takes a lot of time and energy, and for that you need people who have their formation to be able to engage. And somehow we're not there yet. We're still operating on an old model. So it's that somehow we need that. And so if there's anybody who's got words of wisdom on that one, that would be nice.
Thanks, Yvonne. Who wants to respond to that, if anybody? Patrick, looks like you're looking for the microphone. Sure.
Yeah, well, I agree with Yvonne in the sense that I think we're in the middle of a much, much, much bigger paradigm shift than we realize. And living in this time is very difficult because you're blind to it. So I revert to Hegel, and that the first 1,000 years was one aeon, and the next, the Christian era, we'll say, the last 1,000, as Jung argues, was the anti-Christian. So we're now at the synthesis point, which will become the new thesis. And in that sense, there's hope. But when you look at the existential sort of realities, it's pretty grim. But I think that's where, again, where faith comes in. And somehow we need a cosmic perspective. Remi had that. I mean, I think that was his greatest prophetic thing, was he was beyond systems, really. And I could listen to him day in, day out. I came here in '86. I heard him speak in '75 at a United Church, which in itself was sort of prophetic. And I don't know, I think my book will be judged hagiography in time, and I think on one level it is, because I just really felt in all the books I wrote about him that he was somebody to pay attention to. And whatever you can do to draw people's attention to him, he was an extraordinary person, sort of beyond charisma in a way. So that, and his hope was based on this kind of cosmic evolution, I think. Anyway, that's my
Thanks very much, Patrick. If I may just tell a story, as you leave the University Club, you'll see a hill going uphill. Most of you will go to the parking lot, but if you go up the hill, the CSRS is right there at the top of the hill. And as I mentioned, this was the center that Remi founded. And from time to time, he would call me and he would say, well, Pearl and I are coming to town, or I have a medical appointment, and so I'm going to come by. Is it okay? And I would say, sure, come by. We have a meeting every day at 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock at the center, somebody rings a ship's bell. Everybody who's there comes out of their offices, gets tea or coffee, and we meet in this common library and have a conversation for about an hour. And it's one of my jobs is to kind of shepherd that conversation along. Sometimes we don't have a set topic, and when Remi would come, of course, he would become the set topic. And he would, of course, fall right into that groove, very happy to do it, and he would talk about some issue, the kinds of issues we've been talking about today, the environment, women's rights, the Vatican II, and all the things we've been fleshing out today. And he would always, in the middle of that conversation, begin to pass around his ring and talk about the number of popes he had met and the kind of life he had had, and he would sort of constantly share this ring around the room as he was telling his stories about various experiences in the church. And on days when he would come and we would already have a set topic for that day, and it could be a topic led by a 22-year-old MA student who's working on her thesis. She could be a radical atheist. It wouldn't really matter. She's working on some question related to religion and society. And Remi would just slip into that conversation too. And at the end of it, he would sit around sometimes with her 15, 20 minutes later, asking her questions, listening to her, seeing her, being with her, paying attention and learning. And the greatest compliment I got from him was that this is exactly what I had in mind. You know? And so when I see all of you, people who've known him for much longer than I've known him for the most part, I think this is what he had in mind too. So I want to underline what a few people here have said about the value of creating community to deal with what's coming. Yeah? And to deal with what's coming in our individual lives and what's coming in our political lives. So I think I guess I just want to speak on behalf of the folks who are here today, and thank you all for being part of this wonderful experience. And I don't know if you have any closing words you'd like to share? Yes. Yeah, right there. And if you'd like to be involved with the center, please just check out the front, put your name on the list, and we'll be in touch with you. But thank you very much for coming.
I think Jerry had his hand up.
Thank you. My name is Jerry Herkel, and if I may, I'd like to offer some wholehearted thank yous on behalf of all of us this afternoon. First of all, I want to thank all the people who worked so hard to plan this event, this day, which has been an exceptional day. That's the first group. Secondly, I want to thank all of our presenters for sharing so much about the man that we're here to honor today. The third group I want to thank very quickly is the University of Victoria and the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, and all the staff behind the scenes who prepared this wonderful meal for all of us today. So thank you very much for being the host and welcoming us so well. Finally, but next, I want to thank all of us for coming today and for participating in carrying on and making sure that Remi's prophetic vision continues in our lives and in our midst. And that is basically our mission as we leave here today. And then I also want to thank God for sending us Remi as a blessing and for being with us for so long as he served us as a bishop, as a mentor, and as a friend. And finally, I just want to say, as I leave here today, I'm really inspired, and I hope many of you are as well inspired, to live more fully and to promote in our daily lives what Remi, and as Remi did, his vision and values of justice, truth, love, and inclusivity. And so for a very memorable event, and memorable day, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. When Remi and I lectured, I always asked him to read two paragraphs, the two last paragraphs of Chronicles from a Vatican bishop. And so I've asked our elder, Doug Roche, if he would read those two paragraphs to us. And I'm asking you to, it's almost like a moment of silence, if you will. If we could have a moment of silence and have you think of a word that struck you in those two paragraphs. but we'll just do that silently. But we're not finished today yet. Doug?
These are the words of Bishop Remi De Roo. Some people claim these are the worst of times. Others maintain they are the best of times. From a pastoral perspective, I remind all of us that these are the only times. We are called to action now. I have met many people, young and not so young, with brave hearts and splendid ideals. I admire all the energy expended in parish endeavors and church-sponsored or interfaith social projects. However, to you who read these lines, I submit another consideration. There is a vast world out there, desperately in need of an infusion of gospel values, with multitudes of people waiting to be loved into wholeness. Let us not remain focused on our internal structures and concerns. Let us not wait for others to stretch our horizons. Today's world desperately needs our vision and our talents. Trusting in the Spirit, let each one of us reach out to our neighbor in a creative dialogue with all who care about truth and justice. Then we too will be beacons of light and hope for all of humankind to see.
Thank you so much, Doug. Would you like to hear the words again that Doug just read? But shake your head like this. All right, Scott.
Some people claim that these are the worst of times. Others maintain that they are the best of times. From a pastoral perspective, I remind us all that these are the only times. We are called to action now. I have met many people, young and not so young, with brave hearts and splendid ideals. I admire all the energy expended in parish endeavors and church-sponsored or interfaith social projects. However, I submit to you another consideration. There's a vast world out there desperately in need of an infusion of gospel values, with multitudes of people waiting to be loved into wholeness. Let us not remain focused on our internal structures and concerns. Let us not wait for others to stretch our own horizons. Today's world desperately needs our vision and our talents. Trusting in the Spirit, let each one of us reach out to our neighbor in a creative dialogue with all who care about truth and justice. then we too will be beacons of light and hope for all of humankind to see.
I don't have anything to say after those beautiful words, but thank you. Take care. Stay home.